A week later, Nancy returned to her farm, and I to my command at Kimmel Park. It was an idle life now. No men attended parade, all were employed on camp duties, and I found a lieutenant with enough experience to attend to the further instruction of the young officers. My orderly room took about 10 minutes each day, crime was rare, and the adjutant always kept ready and in order the few documents to be signed, which left me free to ride all my 3 chargers over the countryside, in turn, for the rest of the day. I frequently used to visit the present Archbishop of Wales in his palace at St. Asaph. His son had been killed in the 1st Battalion. We discovered a common taste for the curious. I have kept a postcard from him which runs as follows. The Palace, St. Asaph. Hippophagus banquet held at Langham's Hotel, February 1868. A.G. Asaph. Y. I met several bishops during the war, but none afterwards, except the Bishop of Oxford, in a railway carriage, 2 years ago, discussing the beauties of Samuel Richardson, and the Bishop of Liverpool at Harlech, in 1932. I was making tea on the sandhills, when he came out from the sea with cries of pain, having been stung in the thigh by a jellyfish. He gladly accepted a cup of tea, tut-tutting miserably to himself that he had been under the impression that jellyfish stung only in foreign parts. Yes, I know. Wearying of this idleness, I arranged to be transferred to the 16th Officer Cadet Battalion in another part of the same camp. There I did the same sort of work as with the 4th at Oxford, and stayed from February 1918 until the armistice on November 11th. Rill being much healthier than Oxford, I could play games without danger of another breakdown. Nancy got a job at a market gardener's near the camp and came up to live with me. A month or 2 later, she found that she was having a baby, stopped land work, and went back to her drawing. None of my friends had approved of my engagement, particularly to a girl as young as Nancy. One of them, Robbie Ross, Oscar Wilde's literary executor, whom I first met through Siegfried, tried to dissuade me from marriage, hinting, very unkindly, that there was Negro blood in the Nicholson family, that perhaps one of our children might revert to coal black dye. Siegfried could not easily accustom himself to the idea of Nancy, whom he had not met, but he still wrote from Craiglockhart. A few months later, though in no way renouncing his pacifist views, he decided that his only possible course was, after all, to return to France. He had written to me in the previous October that seeing me again made him more restless than ever. He found the isolation of hospital life nearly unbearable. Old Joe had written him a long letter to say that the 1st Battalion were just back at rest. Billets from the Polygon wood fighting. The conditions and general situation were more appalling than anything yet known. 3 miles of morass, shell, holes, corpses, and dead horses through which to bring up the rations. Siegfried felt he would rather be anywhere than in hospital. He couldn't bear to think of poor old Joe lying out all night in shell holes and being shelled. Several of the transport men had been killed, but at least, according to Joe, the battalion got its ration. If only the people who wrote leading articles in the Morning Post about victory could read Joe's letter. When this feat won Joe a DSO, he was sent a slip to complete with biographical details for a new edition of the Companionage and Knightage, but looked contemptuously at the various headings. Disregarding date and place of birth, and even military campaigns, he filled in 2 items only. Issue, rum, rifles, etc. Family seat, my cocky pants. Siegfried now wrote the poem when I'm asleep, dreaming and lulled and warm about the ghosts of solitors, reproaching him in dream for his absence. They had looked for him in the line from Ypres to Frise and not found him. He told Rivers that he would go back to France if they agreed to send him, but made it quite clear that his views were what they had been in July when he wrote the letter of protest, if possible, more violently so. He demanded a written guarantee that he would be sent overseas at once and not kept hanging around a training battalion. In a letter to me, he reprehended the attitude I had taken in July, when I reminded him that the regiment would either think him a coward or regard his protest as a lapse from good form. It was suicidal stupidity and credulity, he wrote, to identify oneself in any way with good form. A man of real courage would not acquiesce as I admitted, he pointed out, that the people who sacrificed the troops were callous bastards, and that the same thing was happening everywhere except in Russia. What my answer was, I forget. Perhaps that, while in France, I had never seen such a fire-eater as he. The number of Germans whom I killed or caused to be killed could hardly be compared with his wholesale slaughter. In fact, Siegfried's unconquerable idealism changed direction with his environment. He varied between happy warrior and bitter pacifist. His poem, "To these I turn, in these I trust, brother lead and sister steel, to his blind power I make appeal. I guard her beauty clean from rust," had originally been inspired by Colonel Campbell, VC's bloodthirsty, spirit of the bayonet address at an army school. Later, Siegfried offered it as a satire, and it certainly comes off, whichever way you read it. I was both more consistent and less heroic than Siegfried. Whether I pulled any strings escapes my memory. At any rate, this time he got posted to the 25th Royal Welch, dismounted yeomanry, in Palestine. He seemed to enjoy the life there, but in April a letter from S somewhere in Ephraim gave me the distressing news that the division had orders for France. He wrote that he would be sorry to get back to trenches, and perhaps go over the top at Morlancourt or Moultay. The mention of Morlancourt in the communiques had brought things home to him. He expected that the 1st and 2nd battalions had about ceased to exist by now, for the nth time. I heard again, at the end of May, from France. Siegfried quoted Duhamel, "It was ordained that you should suffer without purpose and without hope, but I will not let all your sufferings be lost in the abyss." Yet, he wrote the next paragraph in his happy warrior vein, saying that his men were the best he'd ever served with. He wished I could see them. Though I mightn't believe it, he was training them bloody well, and couldn't imagine whence his flame-like ardor had come. But come it had. His military efficiency derived from the admirable pamphlets now being issued, so different from the stuff we used to get 2 years before. He said that when he read my letter he began to think, "Damn Robert. Damn everyone except my company. The smartest turn out ever seen. And damn Wales. And damn leave. And damn being wounded. And damn everything except staying with my company until it has melted away." Limping and crawling among the shell holes, lying very still in the afternoon sunshine in dignified, desecrated attitudes. He asked me to remember this mood when I saw him, if I saw him, worn out and smashed up again, querulous and nerve-ridden. Or when I read something in the casualty list and got a polite letter from Mr. Lasada, his solicitor. There had never been such a battalion, he said, since 1916, but in 6 months it would have ceased to exist. Nancy's brother Tony had also gone to France now, and her mother made herself ill by worrying about him. Early in July he should be due for leave. I was on leave myself at the end of one of the 4 months' cadet courses, staying with the rest of Nancy's family at Maisonneuve, a big Tudor house near Harlech. This was the most haunted house that I have ever been in, though the ghosts, with one exception, were not visible, except occasionally in the mirrors. They would open and shut doors, rap on the oak panels, knock the shades off lamps, and drink the wine from the glasses at our elbows when we were not looking. The house belonged to an officer in the 2nd Battalion, whose ancestors had most of them died of drink. The visible ghost was a little yellow dog that would appear on the lawn in the early morning to announce deaths. Nancy saw it through the window that time. The first Spanish influenza epidemic began, and Nancy's mother caught it, but did not want to miss Tony's leave and going to the London theaters with him. So when the doctor came, she took quantities of aspirin, reduced her temperature, and pretended to be all right. But she knew that the ghosts in the mirrors knew the truth. She died in London on July 13th, A few days later, her chief solace, as she lay dying, was that Tony had got his leave prolonged on her account. I was alarmed at the effect that the shock of her death might have on Nancy's baby. Then I heard that Siegfried had been shot through the head that same day while making a daylight patrol through long grass in no man's land, but not killed. And he wrote me a verse letter from a London hospital, which I cannot quote, though I should like to do so. Beginning, I'd time my death and action to the minute. It is the most terrible of his war poems. Tony was killed in September. I went on mechanically at my cadet battalion work. The new candidates for commissions were mostly Manchester cotton clerks and Liverpool shipping clerks, men with a good fighting record, quiet and well-behaved. To forget about the war, I was writing Country Sentiment, a book of romantic poems and ballads. In November came the armistice. I heard at the same time of the deaths of Frank Jones Bateman, who had gone back again just before the end, and Wilfred Owen, who often used to send me poems from France. Armistice night hysteria did not touch our camp much, though some of the Canadians stationed there went down to Rhyl to celebrate in true overseas style. The news sent me out walking alone along the dike above the marshes of Rhuddlan, an ancient battlefield, the Flodden of Wales, cursing and sobbing and thinking of the dead. Siegfried's famous poem, celebrating the armistice, began. Everybody suddenly burst out singing, and I was filled with such delight, as prisoned birds must find in freedom. But everybody did not include me. 26. In the middle of December, the cadet battalions were wound up, and the officers, after a few days' leave, sent back to their units. I had orders to rejoin the Royal Welsh 3rd Battalion, now at the Castle Barracks, Limerick, but decided to overstay my leave until the baby was born. Nancy expected it early in January 1919, and her father took a house at Hove for the occasion. Jenny, born on Twelfth Night, was neither coal-black nor affected by the shocks of the previous months. Nancy had no foreknowledge of the experience. I assumed that she must have been given some sort of warning, and it took her years to recover from it. I went over to Limerick, and there lied my way out of the overstaying of leave. Limerick being a Sinn Féin stronghold, constant clashes occurred between the troops and the young men of the town, yet little ill feeling. Welsh and Irish always got on well together, just as Welsh and Scottish were sure to disagree. The Royal Welsh had the situation comfortably in hand. They made a joke of politics and turned their entrenching tool handles into shillelaghs. Limerick looked like a war-ravaged town. The main streets were pitted with holes like shell craters, and many of the bigger houses seemed on the point of collapse. Old Riley at the antique shop, who remembered my grandfather well, told me nobody built new houses at Limerick now. The birth rate was declining, and when one fell down, the survivors moved into another. He also said that everyone fed of drink in Limerick except the Plymouth Brethren, who died of religious melancholia. Life did not start in the town before 9 in the morning. Once, at about that time, I walked down O'Connell Street, formerly King George Street, and found it deserted. When the hour chimed, the door of a magnificent Georgian house flew open, and out came in. First a shower of slops, which just missed me. Then a dog, which lifted up its leg against a lamp post. Then a nearly naked child, who sat down in the gutter and rummaged in a heap of refuse for filthy pieces of bread. Finally a donkey, which began to bray. I had pictured Ireland exactly so, and felt its charm as dangerous. When detailed to search for concealed rifles at the head of a task force in a neighboring village, I asked Atwater, then still adjutant, to find a substitute, explaining that as an Irishman I did not care to be mixed up in Irish politics. That January I played my last game of rugger, as fullback for the battalion against Limerick City. We were all Crocs, and our opponents seemed bent on showing what fine fighting material England had lost by withholding home rule. How jovially they jumped on me and rubbed my face in the mud. My new loyalty to Nancy and Jenny tended to overshadow regimental loyalty now that the war seemed to be over. Once I began writing a rhymed nonsense letter to them in my quarters overlooking the barrack square. "Is there any song sweet enough for Nancy or for Jenny?" said Simple Simon to the pieman. "Indeed, I know not any." No. I have counted the miles to Babylon. I have flown the earth like a bird. I have ridden cock-horse to Banbury Cross. But no such song have I heard." At that moment some companies of the battalion returned to barracks from a route march. The drums and fifes drew up under my window, making the panes rattle with the British Grenadiers. The insistent repetition of the tune and the hoarse words of command as the parade formed up in the square, company by company, challenged Banbury Cross and Babylon. The British Grenadiers succeeded for a moment in forcing their way into the poem. Some speak of Alexander, and some of Hercules, and then were repulsed. But where are there any like Nancy and Jenny? Where are there any like these? Had I ceased to be a British Grenadier? I decided to resign my commission at once. Consulting the priority list of trades for demobilization, I found that agricultural workers and students were among the first classes to go. I did not particularly want to be a student again, and would rather have been an agricultural worker. Nancy and I had spoken of farming when the war ended, but where was my agricultural background? And I could take a 2-year course at Oxford with a government grant of £200 a year, and be excused the intermediate examination, MODS, on account of war service. The preliminary examination I had already been excused because of a higher certificate examination passed at Charterhouse, so there remained only the finals. The grant would be increased by a children's allowance. It seemed absurd at the time to suppose that university degrees would count for anything in a regenerated post-war England. But Oxford offered itself as a convenient place to mark time, until I felt more like earning a life. We were all accustomed to the wartime view that the sole qualification for peacetime employment would be a good record of service in the field, that we expected our scars and our commanding officers' testimonials to get us whatever we want. A few of my fellow officers did manage, as a matter of fact, to take advantage of the employer's patriotic spirit before it cooled again, sliding into jobs for which they were not properly qualified. I wrote to a friend in the War Office Demobilization Department, asking him to hurry through my release. He wrote back that he would do his best, but that I must not have had charge of government monies for the past 6 months. As it happened, I had not at the time, but Atwater suddenly decided to put me in command of a company. He complained of being disastrously short of officers who could be trusted with company accounts. The latest arrivals from the new Army battalions were a constant shame to the senior officers. Paternity orders, steamer checks, and drunkenness on parade grew frequent, not to mention table manners at which Sergeant Malley stood aghast. We now had 2 mess ante rooms, the junior and the senior. Yet if a junior officer happened to be regimentally a gentleman, belonged, that is, to the North Wales landed gentry, or came from Sandhurst, the colonel invited him to use the senior ante room and mix with his own class. The situation must have seemed very strange to the 3-line battalion's second lieutenants captured at Mons in 1914, now promoted captains by the death of most of their contemporaries, and set free by the terms of the armistice. Atwater cancelled the intended appointment only when I promised to help him with the battalion theatricals now being arranged for St. David's Day. I undertook to place Cinna in Julius Caesar. His change of mind saved me over £200, because next day the senior lieutenant of the company, which I was to have taken over, went off with the cash box, and I should have been legally responsible for its loss. Before the war, he used to give displays on Blackpool Pier as the Handcuff King. He got away safely to the United States. I rode out a few miles from Limerick to visit my uncle, Robert Cooper, at Cooper's Hill. He was a farmer, a retired naval commander, and the Sinn Feiners had begun burning his ricks and driving his cattle. Through the window he showed me distant herds grazing beside the Shannon. "They have been there all winter," he said despondently, "but I haven't had the heart to take a look at them these 3 months." I spent the night at Cooper's Hill. and woke up with a sudden chill, which I recognized as the first symptoms of Spanish influenza. Back at the barracks, I found that a War Office telegram had come through for my demobilization, but that all demobilization among troops in Ireland was to be stopped on the following day for an indefinite period because of the troubles. Atwater, showing me the telegram, said, "We're not going to let you go. You promised to help me with those theatricals." I protested. He stood firm. But I did not intend to have influenza at an Irish mule hospital with my lungs in their present condition. I decided to make a run for it. The orderly room sergeant had made out my papers on receipt of the telegram. All my kit lay ready packed. There remained only two things to get: the commanding officer's signature to the statement that I had handled no company monies, and the secret code, marks which the battalion demobilization officer alone could supply. But he was hand in no glove with Atwater, so I dared not ask him for them. The last train before demobilization ended would be the 6:15 from Limerick that same evening, February 13th. My one hope was to wait until Atwater left the orderly room and then casually asked the commanding officer to sign the statement, without mentioning Atwater's objection to my going. Atwater remained in the orderly room until 5 minutes past 6 Deutsche. As soon as he was out of sight, I hurried in, saluted, got the necessary signature. Fortunately, my old friend McCartney Filgate was now in command, saluted again, and hurried away to collect my baggage. I had counted on a jaunting car at the barrack gates, but found none. About 5 minutes left, and the station a good distance away. A 1st Battalion corporal passed. I shouted to him, "Corporal Summers, quick! Get a squad of men! I've got my ticket and must catch the last train home." Summers promptly called 4 men. They picked up my stuff and doubled off with it, left, right, left, to the station. I tumbled into the train as it moved slowly out and threw a pound note to Corporal Summers. "Goodbye, Corporal, drink my health." Yet still I had not got my code marks, and knew that when I reached the demobilization center at Wimbledon, the officers there would refuse to let me go. Not that I cared very much. I should at least have my influenza in an English, and not an Irish hospital. My temperature was running high, and my mind working clearly, as it always does in fever, with its visual imagery, which is cloudy and partial at ordinary times, defined and complete. We reached Fishguard after a rough crossing. I bought a copy of the South Wales Echo and read that a strike of London Electric Railwaymen would take place the next day, February 14th, unless the railway directors met the union's demand. So as the train steamed into Paddington, I jumped out, fell down, picked myself up, and ran across to the station entrance where, in spite of competition from porters, a feeble crew at this period, I seized the only taxi in sight as its occupant paid the fare. I had foreseen the taxi shortage and could afford to waste no time. I brought my taxi back to the train, where scores of stranded officers eyed me with envy. One, a fellow traveler in my compartment, had been met by his wife. "Excuse me," I said, "but would you like to share my taxi anywhere? I have influenza, I warn you. I'm going down to Wimbledon, so I shall be getting out at Waterloo. The steam trains are still running." That delighted them, because they lived at Ealing and had no idea how to get home except by taxi. On the way to Waterloo, he said, "I wish there were some way of showing our gratitude, something we could do for you." Well, there's only one thing in the world that I want at the moment. But you can't give it to me, I'm afraid. And that's the set of secret code marks to complete my demobilization papers. I've bolted from Ireland without them, and there'll be hell to pay if the Wimbledon people send me back. He rapped on the glass of the taxi, told the driver to stop, got down his bag, opened it, and produced a satchel of army forms. "Well," he said, "I happen to be the Cork District Demobilization Officer, and here's the whole bag of tricks." Then he filled in my papers. At Wimbledon, instead of having to wait in a queue for the expected 9 or 10 hours, I got released at once. Ireland was officially a theater of war, and demobilization from theaters of war had priority over home service demobilization. After a hurried visit to my parents, now back in our own house half a mile across the common, I went on to Hove. Arriving at supper time, I warned Nicholson about my influenza and hurried away to bed. Within a day or two, the whole family caught it, except Nicholson, Jenny, and the housemaid, a Welsh gypsy, who kept it off by a charm, the leg of a lizard tied in a bag round her neck. A new epidemic as bad as the summer one had started. Not a nurse could be found in Albright. Nicholson at last rounded up 2 ex-nurses, one competent, but frequently drunk, and with the habit, when drunk, of ransacking all the wardrobes in the house and piling the contents into her own bag. The other, sober, but incompetent, would stand a dozen times a day in front of the open window, arms outspread, and cry in a stage voice, "See, see, give my husband back to me." The husband, by the way, was not drowned, merely unfaithful. A doctor, found with equal difficulty, gave me no hope of recovery. It was septic pneumonia now, and had affected both my lungs. But, having come through the war, I refused to the influenza. This made the 3rd time in my life that I had been given up, and each time because of my lungs. I should have mentioned in my first chapter the double pneumonia following measles, which nearly did for me at the age of 7. Maggie, the gypsy servant, wept whenever she dusted my room. I thought because of a tiff with her young man. But these were tears for me, my widow, and my orphan girl. I focused attention on a poem, The Troll's Nosegay, which was giving me trouble. I had taken it through 30 drafts, and still it would not come right. The 35th draft passed scrutiny. I felt better, and Maggie smiled again. Nancy's attack was a light one, fortunately. A few weeks later, I watched a mutiny of the Guards, when about 1,000 men of all regiments marched out from Shoreham Camp and paraded through the Brighton streets in protest against unnecessary restriction. The troops' impatience of military discipline between the armistice and the signing of peace delighted Siegfried. He had taken a prominent part in the general election, which Lloyd George forced immediately after the armistice, asking for a warrant to hang the Kaiser and make a stem peace. Siegfried, supporting Philip Snowden's candidature on a pacifist platform, had faced a threatening civilian crowd. He trusted that his 3 wounded stripes and the mauve and white military cross ribbon, which he had not thrown away with the cross itself, would give him a privileged hearing. Snowden and Ramsay MacDonald were now perhaps the 2 most unpopular men in England, and whatever hopes we had nursed of a general anti-governmental rising by ex-servicemen soon faded. Once back in England, they were content with a roof over their heads, civilian food, beer that was at least better than French beer, and enough blankets at night. Any overcrowding in their home was as nothing compared to what they had grown accustomed to. A derelict French 4-roomed cottage would provide billets for 60 men. Having won the war, they were satisfied and left the rest to Lloyd George. The only serious outbreak took place at Rhyl. There, a 2-day mutiny of young Canadians caused much destruction and several deaths. The signal for the rising was a cry, "Come on, the Bolsheviks!" Nancy, Jenny, and I went up to Harlech, where Nicholson lent us his house to live in. We were there for a year. I discarded my uniform, having worn nothing else for 4.5 years, and looked into my trunk to see what civilian clothes I still had. The one suit, other than school uniform, which I found, no longer fitted. The Harlech villagers treated me with the greatest respect. At the Peace Day celebrations in the castle, I was asked, as the senior man of Harlech who had served overseas, to make a speech about the glorious dead. I spoke in commendation of the Welshman as a fighting man and earned loud cheers. But not only did I have no experience of independent civilian life, having gone straight from school into the army, I was still mentally and nervously organized for war. Shells used to come bursting on my bed at midnight, even though Nancy shared it with me. Strangers in daytime would assume the faces of friends who had been killed. When strong enough to climb the hill behind Harlech and revisit my favorite country, I could not help seeing it as a prospective battlefield. I would find myself working out tactical problems, planning how best to hold the upper Artro Valley against an attack from the sea, or where to place a Lewis gun if I were trying to rush Dalridiog Farm from the brow of the hill, and what would be the best cover for my rifle. Grenade section. T-Seal Ball. I still had the army habit of commandeering anything of uncertain ownership that I found lying about. Also, a difficulty in telling the truth. It was always easier for me now, when charged with any fault, to lie my way out in army style. I applied the technique of taking over billets or trenches to a review of my present situation. Food, water supply, possible dangers, communication, sanitation, protection against the weather, fuel and light. I ticked off each item as satisfactory. Other loose habits of wartime survived, such as stopping cars for a lift, talking without embarrassment to my fellow travelers in railway carriages, and unbuttoning by the roadside without shame, whoever might be about. Also, I retained the technique of endurance, a brutal persistence in seeing things through, somehow, anyhow, without finesse, satisfied with the main points of any situation. But at least I modified my unrestrainedly foul language. The greatest difficulty lay in facing the problem of money, which had not worried me since those first days at Wrexham. But at the moment my savings of some £150 sterling, my wall bonus of £250, the disability pension of £60 a year that I now drew, and occasional sums that came in from poems, seemed plenty. Nancy and I engaged a nurse and a general servant, and lived as though we had an income of £1,000 a year. Nancy spent much of her time illustrating some poems of mine. I got my country sentiment in order and wrote reviews. Very thin, very nervous, and with about 4 years' loss of sleep to make up, I was waiting until I got well enough to go to Oxford on the government educational grant. I knew that it would be years before I could face anything but a quiet country life. My disabilities were many. I could not use a telephone. I felt sick every time I traveled by train, and to see more than 2 new people in a single day prevented me from sleeping. I felt ashamed of myself as a drag on Nancy, but had sworn on the very day of my demobilization never to be under anyone's orders for the rest of my life. Somehow I must live by writing. Siegfried had gone to live at Oxford as soon as demobilized, expecting me to join him. However, after a couple of terms there, he accepted the literary editorship of the newly published Daily Herald. He sent me books to review for it. In those days, the Daily Herald was not respectable, but violently anti-militarist, and the only daily newspaper that dared protest against the Versailles Treaty and the blockade of Russia by the British fleet. The Treaty of Versailles shocked me. It seemed destined to cause another war someday, yet nobody cared. While the most critical decisions were being taken in Paris, public interest concentrated entirely on 3 home news items: Hawker's Atlantic Flight and Rescue, the marriage of England's reigning beauty, Lady Diana Manners, and a marvelous horse called the Panther, the Derby favorite, which came in nowhere. The Herald spoiled our breakfast every morning. We read in it of unemployment all over the country due to the closing of munition factories, of ex-servicemen refused reinstatement in the jobs they had left when war broke out, of market rigging, lockouts, and abortive strikes. I began to hear news, too, of the penury to which my mother's relatives in Germany had been reduced, particularly the retired officials whose pensions, by the collapse of the mark, now amounted to only a few shillings a week. Nancy and I took all this to heart, and called ourselves socialists. My family, who were living permanently in Harlech, having sold the house at Wimbledon, did not know quite how to treat me. I had fought gallantly for my country, indeed. Of 6 brothers, I alone had seen active service, and my shocked state entitled me to every consideration. But my sympathy for the Russian rebellion against the corrupt Tsarist government outraged them. I once more forfeited the goodwill of my Uncle Charles. My father tried to talk me over, reminding me that my brother Philip, once a pro-Boer and a Fenian, had recovered from his youthful revolutionary idealism and come out all right in the end. Most of my elder brothers and sisters were in the Near East, either British officials or married to British officials. My father hoped that when I recovered I would go to Egypt, perhaps in the consular service, where the family influence would help me, and there get over my revolutionary enthusiasm. Socialism with Nancy was a means to a single end, namely judicial equality between the sexes. She ascribed all the wrong in the world to male domination and narrowness, and would not see my experiences in the war as anything comparable with the sufferings that millions of working-class married women went through without complaint. This, at least, had the effect of putting the war into the background for me. My love for Nancy made me respect her views. But male stupidity and callousness became such an obsession with her that she began to include me in her universal condemnation of men. Soon, she could not bear a newspaper in the house, for fear of reading some paragraph that would horrify her, about the necessity of keeping up the population, or about women's limited intelligence, or about the shameless, flat-chested modern girl, or anything at all about women written by clergymen. We joined the newly formed Constructive Birth Control Society and distributed its literature among the village women, to the scandal of my family. What made things worse was that neither of us went to Harlech Church, and we refused to baptize Jenny. My father even wrote to Nancy's godfather, who happened to be my publisher, asking him to persuade Nancy, for whose religion he had promised at the font to be responsible, into giving her child Christian baptism. It scandalized them, too, that Nancy kept her own name for all purposes, refusing to be called Mrs. Graves in any circumstances. She explained that as Mrs. Graves she had no personal validity. Children, at that time, were the sole property of the father, the mother not being legally a parent. 27. In October 1919 I went to Oxford at last, and Nicholson gave us the Harlech furniture to take along. Oxford was overcrowded. The lodging house keepers, some of whom nearly starved during the war, now had their rooms booked up terms ahead and charged accordingly. Cable College built a row of huts for its surplus students. Not an unfurnished house could be rented anywhere within the 3-mile radius. I solved the difficulty by pleading ill health and getting permission from St. John's College to live 5 miles out on Boar's Hill, where John Masefield, who thought well of my poetry, had offered to rent us a cottage at the bottom of his garden. We found the university remarkably quiet. The returned solidars did not feel tempted to rag about, break windows, get drunk, or have tussles with the police and races with the proctors, bulldogs, as in the old days. The boys straight from the public schools kept quiet too, having had war preached at them continually for 4 years, with orders to carry on loyally at home while their brothers served in the trenches and make themselves worthy of such sacrifices. Since the boys went off to cadet battalions at the age of 17, the masters kept firm control of the schools. Trouble there nearly always came from the 18-year-old G. N. Clark, a history don at Oriel, who had got his degree at Oxford just before the war, and meanwhile been an infantryman in France and a prisoner in Germany, told me, "I can't make out my pupils at all. They are all yes, sir, and no, sir. They seem positively to thirst for knowledge and scribble away in their notebooks like lunatics. I can't remember a single instance of such stern endeavor in pre-war days." The ex-servicemen, who included scores of captains, majors, colonels, and even a one-armed 25-year-old brigadier, insisted on their rights. At St. John's, they formed a college soviet, successfully demanded an entire revision of the scandalous catering system, and chose an undergraduate representative to sit on the kitchen committee. The elder dons, whom I had often seen during the war trembling in fear of an invasion, with the sacking and firing of the Oxford colleges and the rape of their families in the Woodstock and Banbury roads, and who then regarded all soldiers myself included, as their noble saviors, now recovered their pre-war self-possession and haughtiness. The change in their manner amused me. My moral tutor, however, though he no longer saluted me when we met, remained a friend. He persuaded the college to let me change my course from classics to English language and literature, and take up my £60 sterling classical exhibition notwithstanding. I felt glad now that it was only an exhibition, not a scholarship, though in 1913 this had disappointed me. College regulations permitted exhibitioners to be married. Scholars must remain single. I found the English literature course tedious, especially the insistence on 18th century poets. My tutor, Percy Simpson, the editor of Ben Jonson's plays, sympathized, telling me that he'd suffered once, as a boy, for preferring the romantic revivalists. When his schoolmaster beat him for reading Shelley, he had protested between the blows. "Shelley is beautiful! Shelley is beautiful!" Yet, he warned me not on any account to disparage the 18th century when I sat for my finals. I also found it difficult to concentrate on cases, genders, and irregular verbs in Anglo-Saxon grammar. The Anglo-Saxon lecturer was candid about his subject. It was, he said, a language of purely linguistic interest, and hardly a line of Anglo-Saxon poetry extant possessed the slightest literary merit. I disagreed. I thought of Beowulf lying wrapped in a blanket among his platoon of drunken thanes in the Gothland billet, Judith going for a promenade to Holofernes' staff tent, and Brunanburh with its bayonet, and Kosh fighting. All this came far closer to most of us than the drawing room and dear park atmosphere of the 18th century. Edmund Blunden, who also had leave to live on Boar's Hill because of gassed lungs, was taking the same course. The war still continued for both of us, and we translated everything into trench warfare terms. In the middle of a lecture, I would have a sudden very clear experience of men on the march up the Bethune-le-Bossé road. The men would be singing, while French children ran along beside us, calling out, "Tommy, Tommy, give me bully beef," and I would smell the stench of the knacker's yard just outside the town. Or it would be in Lavendy High Street, passing a company billet, and NCO would roar, "Party, shun," and the 2nd Battalion men in shorts, with brown knees and brown, expressionless faces, would spring to their feet from the broken steps where they were sitting. Or I would be in a barn with my 1st platoon of the Welsh regiment, watching them play nap by the light of dirty candle stumps. Or in a deep dug out at Cambren, talking to a signaller. I would look up the shaft and see somebody's muddy legs coming down the steps. Then there would be a sudden crash, and the tobacco smoke in the dug out would shake with the concussion and twist about in patterns like the marbling on books. These daydreams persisted like an alternate life and did not leave me until in 1928. The scenes were nearly always recollections of my first 4 months in France. The emotion recording apparatus seemed to have failed after Luz. The 18th century owed its unpopularity largely to its Frenchness. Anti-French feeling among most ex-soldiers amounted almost to an obsession. Edmund, shaking with nerves, used to say at this time, "No more wars for me at any price. Except against the French. If there's ever a war with them, I'll go like a shot." Pro-German feeling had been increasing. With the war over and the German armies beaten, we could give the German soldier credit for being the most efficient fighting man in Europe. I often heard it said that only the blockade had beaten the Fritzes, that in Haig's last push they never really broke, and that their machine gun sections held us up long enough to cover the withdrawal of the main forces. Some undergraduates even insisted that we had been fighting on the wrong side. Our natural enemies were the French. At the end of my first term's work, I attended the usual college board to give an account of myself. The spokesman coughed and said a little stiffly, "I understand, Mr. Graves, that the essays which you write for your English tutor are, shall I say, a trifle temperamental. It appears indeed that you prefer some authors to others." A number of poets were living on Boar's Hill. Too many, Edmund and I agreed. It was now almost a tourist center, dominated by Robert Bridges, the poet laureate, with his bright eye, abrupt, challenging manner, and a flower in his buttonhole, one of the first men of letters to sign the Oxford Recantation of War. Time hatred against the Germans. Dr. Gilbert Murray lived there too, gentle-voiced, and with the spiritual look of the strict vegetarian, doing preliminary propaganda work for the League of Nations. Once, as I sat talking to him in his study about Aristotle's Poetics, while he walked up and down, I suddenly asked, "Exactly what is the principle of that walk of yours? Are you trying to avoid the flowers on the rug, or are you trying to keep to the squares?" My own compulsion neuroses made it easy for me to notice them in others. He wheeled around sharply. "You're the first person who has caught me out," he said. "No, it's not the flowers or the squares. It's a habit that I have got into of doing things in sevens. I take 7 steps, you see, then I change direction and go another 7 steps. Then I turn around." I consulted Brown, the professor of psychology, about it the other day, but he assured me it isn't a dangerous habit. He said, "When you find yourself getting into multiples of 7, come to me again." I saw most of John Masefield, a nervous, generous, correct man, very sensitive to criticism, who seemed to have suffered greatly in the war. As an orderly in a Red Cross unit, he was now working on Reynard the Fox. He rode in a hut in his garden, surrounded by tall gorse bushes, and only appeared at mealtimes. In the evening he used to read his day's work over to Mrs. Masefield, and they corrected it together. Masefield being at the height of his reputation at the time, a constant stream of American visitors washed against his door. Mrs. Masefield protected Jean. She came from the north of Ireland and put a necessary brake on Jean's generosity and sociability. We admired her careful housekeeping and the way she stood up for her rights where less resolute people would have shrunk. As an example, some neighbors of ours had a particularly stupid Airedale. They were taking it for a walk when a wild rabbit ran across the road from the Masefield's gorse plantation. The Airedale dashed at the rabbit and missed as usual. The rabbit, not giving it sufficient credit for stupidity and slowness, doubled back, but found the dog not yet recovered from its mistake and ran right into its open jaws. The dog's owners, delighted at the brilliant performance of their pet, retrieved the rabbit, which was a small and inexperienced one, and took it home for the pot. Mrs. Masefield had been watching through the plantation fence. This not being strictly a public road, the rabbit was legally hers. That evening, they heard a knock at the door. "Come in, do come in, Mrs. Masefield." She had called to demand the skin of her rabbit. Mrs. Masefield's one extravagance was bridge. She used to play at halfpenny a hundred to steady her play. But she was a considerate landlord to us, and advised Nancy to keep up with me intellectually, if she wished to hold my affections. Another poet on Boar's Hill was Robert Nichols, one more neurasthenic ex-soldier, with his flame opal ring, his wide-brimmed hat, his flapping arms, and a mournful grandeur in repose. The phrase comes from a review by Sir Edmund Gosse. Nichols served only 3 weeks in France, with the gunners, and got involved in no show, but, being highly strung, he got invalided out of the army and went to lecture on British war poets in America for the Ministry of Information. He read Siegfried's poetry and mine, and started a legend of Siegfried himself, and me as the new 3 Musketeers, though the 3 of us had never once been together in the same room. That winter, George and Ruth Mallory invited Nancy and myself to go climbing with them. But Nancy could not stand heights and was having another baby, and I realized that my climbing days were over. I could never again now deliberately take chances with my life. In March, the baby arrived, and we called him David. My mother was overjoyed to have secured the first Graves grandson. My elder brothers had only girls. Here at last was an heir for the family silver and documents. At Jenny's birth she had condoled with Nancy. Perhaps it is as well to have a girl first, to practice on. Nancy was determined to have 4 children. They were to resemble the children in her drawings, and be girl, boy, girl, boy, in that order. She intended to get it all over with quickly. She believed in young parents with families of 3 or 4 children fairly close together in age. She had her way exactly, but began to regret her marriage as a breach of faith with herself, a concession to patriarchy. She wanted somehow to be dismarried, not by divorce, which was as bad as marriage, so that she and I could live together without any legal or religious obligation to do so. I now met Dick again for the last time and found him disagreeably pleasant. He was up at Oxford, about to enter the diplomatic service, and so greatly changed that it seemed absurd to have ever suffered on his account. Yet the caricature likeness to the boy I had loved persisted. 28. The first time I met Colonel T.Y.E. Lawrence, he happened to be wearing full evening dress. That must have been in February or March 1920, and the occasion was a guest night at All Souls, where he had been awarded a 7 years fellowship. The formality of evening dress concentrates attention on eyes, and Lawrence's eyes immediately held me. They were startlingly blue, even by artificial light, and never met the eyes of the person he addressed, but flickered up and down as though making an inventory of clothes and limbs. I was only an accidental guest and knew few people there. Lawrence, talking to the Regius Professor of Divinity about the influence of the Syrian Greek philosophers on early Christianity, and especially of the importance of the University of Gadara, close to the Lake of Galilee, mentioned that St. James had quoted one of the Gadarene philosophers, I think, Amnesalcus, in his epistle. He went on to speak of Meleager and the other Syrian Greek contributors to the Greek anthology, whose poems he intended to publish in English translation. I joined in the conversation and mentioned a morning star image which Meleager once used in rather an un-Greek way. Lawrence turned to me. You must be Graves the poet? I read a book of yours in Egypt in 1917 and thought it pretty good. This was embarrassing, but kind. He soon began asking me about the younger poets. He was out of touch with contemporary work, he said. I told him what I knew. Lawrence had not long finished with the peace conference, where he acted as advisor to the Emir Faisal, and was now tinkering at the second draft of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, his fellowship having been granted him on condition that he wrote the book as a formal history of the Arab revolt. I used to visit his rooms in the mornings between lectures, but not before 11 o'clock or half past, because he worked by night, going to bed at dawn. Though he never drank himself, he would always send his scout to fetch me a silver goblet of audit ale. Audit ale, brewed in the college, was as soft as barley water, but of great strength. Prince Albert of Schleswig-Holstein had once come down to Oxford to open a new museum. He lunched at All Souls before the ceremony. The mildness of the audit ale deceived him, and later that afternoon they took him back to the station in a cab with the blinds drawn. I knew nothing definite of Lawrence's wartime activities, though my brother Philip had been with him in the intelligence department at Cairo in 1915, making out the Turkish order of battle. I did not question him about the revolt, partly because he seemed to dislike the subject. Lowell Thomas was now lecturing in the United States on Lawrence of Arabia, and partly because of a convention between him and me that the war should not be mentioned. We were both suffering from its effects and enjoying Oxford as a good true relaxation. Thus, though the long, closely written foolscap sheets of the 7 Pillars were always stacked in a neat pile on his living room table, I restrained my curiosity. He occasionally spoke of his archaeological work in Mesopotamia before the war. But poetry, especially modern poetry, was what we discussed most. He wanted to meet what poets there were, and through me came to know, among others, Siegfried Sassoon, Edmund Blunden, Masefield, and later Thomas Hardy. He frankly envied poets. He felt that they had some sort of secret which he might be able to grasp and profit from. He made Charles Doughty his chief hero and got an introduction to him through Hogarth, curator of the Ashmolean Museum, whom he regarded as a second father. Lawrence envisaged the poet's secret as a technical mastery of words, rather than as a particular mode of living and thinking. I had not yet learned enough to be able to dispute this, and when I did begin to learn, some years later found Lawrence difficult to convince. To him, painting, sculpture, music, and poetry were parallel activities, differing only in the medium used. Lawrence told me, when I asked Doughty why he had made that Arabian journey, his answer was that he had gone there to redeem the English language from the slough into which it has fallen since the time of Spenser. These words of Doughty seem to have made a great impression on Lawrence, and largely account, I think, for his furious keying up of style in the Seven Pillars. Vachel Lindsay, the American poet, an extremely simple man, Middle Western clay with a golden streak, came to Oxford, and I persuaded Sir Walter Raleigh, the professor of English literature, to let him have a lecture hall for a poetry reading. Everyone enjoyed the performance, which was an exercise in elocution and mime, not a reading. Afterwards, Lawrence invited Lindsay and his old mother and myself to lunch in his room. Lawrence's scout, scandalized to hear that Lindsay belonged to the Illinois Anti-Saloon League, asked permission to lay on his place a copy of verses composed in 1661 by a fellow of the college. One stanza ran, "The poet divine that cannot reach wine, because that his money doth many times fail, will hit on the vein to make a good strain, if he be but inspired with a pot of good ale." Mrs. Lindsay had been warned by friends to comment on nothing unusual that she met at Oxford, and when Lawrence brought out the college gold service in her honor, she took this to be the ordinary thing at a university luncheon party, apologized for it as being of no great antiquity. But the college had been patriotic during the Civil War and melted down all its plate to help pay King Charles' expenses while he made Oxford his headquarters. Lawrence's rooms were dark and oak-paneled, with a large table and a desk as the principal furniture. There were also 2 heavy leather chairs, simply acquired. An American oil financier had come in suddenly one day when I was there and said, "I am here from the States, Colonel Lawrence, to ask a single question. You are the only man who will answer it honestly. Do Middle Eastern conditions justify my putting any money in South Arabian oil?" "Anyway," Lawrence, without rising, quietly answered, "No. That's all I wanted to know. It was worth coming for. Thank you and good day." In his brief glance about the room he missed something, and on his way home through London chose the chairs and had them sent to Lawrence with his card. Other things in the room were pictures, including Augustus John's portrait of the Emir Faisal, which Lawrence, I believe, bought from John with the diamond he had worn as a mark of honor in his Arab headdress. His books, including a Kelmscott Chaucer, 3 prayer rugs, the gift of Arab leaders, one of them with a lapis lazuli sheen on the nap, the Tel Sham station bell from the Hejaz Railway, and on the mantelpiece a 4,000-year-old toy, a clay soldier on horseback from a child's grave at Carchemish, where Lawrence had dug before the war. I was working on a new book of poems, which reflected my haunted condition. It appeared later under the title of The Pier Glass. Lawrence made a number of suggestions for improving these poems, most of which I adopted. He behaved very much like an undergraduate at times. One day I happened to visit the top of the Radcliffe camera and looked down on the roofs of neighboring colleges. From a pinnacle of All Souls fluttered a small crimson Hejaz flag. Lawrence had been a famous roof climber when up at Jesus College 12 years before this. He told me of 2 or 3 schemes for brightening All Souls in Oxford generally. One was for improving the rotten turf in the quadrangle. He had suggested at a college meeting that it should be manured or replaced. No action was taken. He now proposed to plant mushrooms on it, so that they would be forced to returf the whole extent, and consulted a mushroom expert in town. But the technical difficulties of mushroom culture proved to be great, and Lawrence went away to help Winston Churchill with the Middle Eastern settlement of 1922 before they could be overcome. Another scheme, for which he enlisted my help, was to steal the Magdalen College deer. We would drive them one early morning into the small inner quadrangle of All Souls, having persuaded the college to answer the Magdalen protests with a declaration that it was the All Souls herd, pastured there from time immemorial. Great things were expected of this raid, but we needed Lawrence as the stage manager, so it fell through when he left us. However, he engineered a successful strike by the college servants for better pay and hours, and such a thing had never happened before since the foundation of the university. Lawrence also proposed to present the college with a peacock which, once accepted, would be found to bear the name Nathaniel, after Lord Curzon, an enemy of Lawrence's, and vice-chancellor of the university. One morning I went to his rooms, and he introduced me to a visitor there. "Ezra Pound, Robert Graves, you will dislike each other," he said. "What's wrong with him?" I asked afterwards, having felt very uncomfortable in Pound's presence. "They tell me that he's Longfellow's grandnephew, and when a man's a modernist that takes some living down." He's shady. At the same time, Lawrence was getting to know the leading painters and sculptors, and trying to grasp their secret too. He used to sit as a model to see what they made of him, and compare the results. Recently, I saw Sir William Orpin's version, a curious, almost libellous magnification of a seldom-seen element in Lawrence's character, a sort of street urchin furtiveness. It counterbalances Augustus John's too sentimentally heroic portrait. Professor Edgeworth, of All Souls, avoided conversational English, persistently using words and phrases that one expects to meet only in books. One evening, Lawrence returned from a visit to London, and Edgeworth met him at the gate. Was it very colliginous in the metropolis? Aye, wonderful. Somewhat colliginous, but not altogether inspissated, Lawrence replied gravely. I remember having tea with him at Fuller's tea shop, and the scandal he caused by clapping his hands for the waitress in Oriental fashion. And one afternoon, he rang the station bell from his window into the quadrangle. Good God, I said, you'll wake the whole college. It needs waking up. So, we plan to collaborate in a burlesque on contemporary writers, in the style of a government blue book. I said, first we must get a blue book and study it. He agreed to buy one next time he went to London. When he asked at the stationery office for a blue book, the clerk asked, which blue book? We have hundreds. Whichever you like. Mistaking his indifference for guilty embarrassment, the clerk handed him the report of a royal commission on venereal disease. I teased him once for standing on the fender over the fire. I pretended that he did it to make himself look taller. He denied this hotly, insisting that the onus of proving oneself of any use in the world lay with tall people like myself. This encouraged me to a ragging pretense of physical violence, but I immediately stopped when I caught the look in his face. I had surprised his morbid horror of being touched. I took no part in undergraduate life, seldom visiting St. John's except to draw my government grant and exhibition money, and refused to pay the college games subscription, as being unfit for games myself, and having no leisure to watch them. Most of my friends were at Balliol and Queen's, and Wadham had a prior claim on my loyalty. At this time I had little to do with the children. They were in the hands of Nancy and the nurse. Nancy felt that she needed some activity besides drawing, but could not decide what. One evening, in the middle of the long vacation, she suddenly said, I must get away out of all this at once. Boars Hill stifles me. Let's go off on bicycles somewhere. 9. We packed a few things and rode off in the general direction of Devon. The nights were coldish, and not having brought any blankets, we bicycled by night and slept by day. We rode across Salisbury Plain in the moonlight, passing Stonehenge and several deserted army camps, which had an even more ghostly look. They could provide accommodation for 1,000,000 men, the number of men killed in the British and overseas forces during the war. Finding ourselves near Dorchester, we turned aside to visit Thomas Hardy, whom we had met not long before when he came to get his honorary doctor's degree at Oxford. Hardy was active and gay, with none of the aphasia and wandering of attention that we had noticed in him there. I have kept a record of our talk with him. He welcomed us as representatives of the post-war generation, claiming to live such a quiet life at Dorchester that he feared he was altogether behind the time. He wanted, for instance, to know whether we had any sympathy with the Bolshevik regime, and whether he could trust the Morning Post's account of the Red Terror. Then he asked about Nancy's hair, which she wore short, in advance of the fashion, and why she kept her own name. His comment on the name question was, "Why, you are old-fashioned." I knew an old couple here 60 years ago who did the same. The woman was called Nanny Priddle, descendant of an ancient family, the Paradells, long decayed into peasantry, and she would never change her name either. Then he wanted to know why I no longer used my army rank. I explained that I had resigned my commission. "But you have a right to it. I should certainly keep my rank if I had one, and feel very proud to be called Captain Hardy." Elvon. He told us that he was now engaged in restoring a Norman font in a church nearby, only the bowl, but he enjoyed doing a bit of his old work again. Nancy mentioned that our children were not baptized. Interested but not scandalized, he remarked that his mother had always said that, at any rate, there could be no harm in baptism, and that she would not like her children to blame her in afterlife for leaving any duty to them undone. I usually found that what my mother said was right. He told us that, to his mind, the new generation of full clergymen were very much better than the last, though he are doing now. Went to church only 3 times a year. Yeah. One visit to each of the 3 neighboring churches. Could you not forget that in his boyhood, the Gizon Bunman Town Church had been into the center of all musical, literary, and artistic education in a village. He talked about the string orchestras at Wessex churches, in one of which his father, Grandfather Gaya, and he himself had taken part, and regretted their disappearance. He mentioned that the clergyman who appears as Mr. St. Clair in Tess of the D'Urbervilles had protested to the War Office about the Sunday brass band performances at the Dorchester Barracks, and been the cause of headquarters no longer being sent to this very popular station. We took tea in the drawing room, which, like the rest of the house, was cluttered with furniture and ornaments. Hardy had an affection for accumulated possessions, and Mrs. Hardy loved him too well to suggest that anything at all should be removed. With a cup of tea in his hand, he made jokes about bishops at the Athenaeum Club, and imitated their episcopal tones when they ordered China tea and a little bread and butter. Yes, my lord. Apparently, he considered bishops fair game, but soon began censuring Sir Edmund Gosse, who had recently stayed with them, for a breach of good taste in imitating his old friend, Henry James' way of drinking soup. Loyalty to his friends was always a passion with Hardy. After tea we went into the garden, where he asked to see some of my new poems. I fetched him one and he wondered whether he might offer a suggestion. The phrase, "the scent of time," which occurred in it was, he said, one of the clichés which poets of his generation had studied to avoid. Could I perhaps alter it? When I replied that his contemporaries had avoided it so well that I could now use it without offense, he withdrew the objection. "Do you write easily?" he inquired. "This poem is in its 6th draft and will probably be finished in 2 more. Why? He said, "I have never in my life taken more than 3, or perhaps 4, drafts for a poem. I'm afraid of it losing its freshness." He said that he could once sit down and write novels by a timetable, but that poetry always came to him by accident, which perhaps was why he prized it more highly. He spoke disparagingly of his novels, though admitting that he had enjoyed writing certain chapters. As we walked around the garden, Hardy paused at a spot near the greenhouse. He had once been pruning a tree when an idea for a story suddenly entered his head. The best story he had ever conceived, and it came complete with characters, setting, and even some of the dialogue. But not having pencil or paper with him, and wanting to finish his pruning before the weather broke, he took no notes. By the time he sat down at his table to recall the story, all was utterly gone. "Always carry a pencil and paper," he said, adding, "Of course, even if I remembered that story now, I couldn't write it. I'm past novel writing. But I often wonder what it can have been." And Irwan. That night at dinner he grew enthusiastic in praise of cider, which he had drunk since a boy, as the finest medicine he knew. I suggested that in his message to the American people, which he had just been asked to write, he might take the opportunity to recommend cider. Hardy complained of autograph hunters and their persistence. He did not like leaving letters unanswered, and if he did so, these people pestered him the more. He was upset that morning by a letter from an autograph fiend which began, "Dear Mr. Hardy, I am interested to know why the devil you don't reply to my request." He asked me for advice and jumped at the suggestion that a mythical secretary should reply offering his autograph at 1 or 2 guineas, the amount to be sent to a hospital, Wantage Children's Hospital, he put in, which would forward a receipt. He regarded professional critics as parasites, no less noxious than autograph hunters, wished the world rid of them, and also regretted having listened to them as a young man. On their advice he had cut out from his early poems dialect, words which possessed no ordinary English equivalents. And still the critics were plaguing him. One of them complained of a line, his shape smalled in the distance. Now, what in the world else could he have written? Hardy then laughed a little. Once or twice recently he had looked up a word in the dictionary for fear of being again accused of coining, and found it there right enough, only to read on and discover that the sole authority quoted was himself in a half-forgotten novel. He talked of early literary influences, saying that these were negligible because he did not come of literary stock. But he admitted that a fellow apprentice in the architect's office where he worked as a young man used to lend him books. His taste in literature was certainly most unexpected. Once, a few years later, when Lawrence ventured to say something disparaging about Homer's Iliad, he protested, "Oh, but I admire it greatly. Why, it's in the Mannion class." Lawrence at first thought that Hardy was having a little joke. "Young monsieur." We left the next day, after another of Hardy's attacks on the critics at breakfast. He complained that they accused him of pessimism. One critic singled out as an example of gloom his poem on the woman whose house burned down on her wedding night. "Of course it's a humorous piece," said Hardy, and the man must have been thick-witted not to see that. On reading his criticism, I went through my last collection of poems with a pencil, marking them N.C. according as they were sad, neutral, or cheerful. I found them in pretty equal proportions, which nobody could call pessimism. In his opinion, vers libre could come to nothing in England. All we can do is to write on the old themes in the old styles, but try to do a little better than those who went before us. Of his own poems, he told me that, once written, he cared very little what happened to them. He described his war work, rejoicing to have been chairman of the Anti-Profiteering Committee, and to have succeeded in bringing a number of rascally Dorchester tradesmen to book. It made me unpopular, of course, he admitted, but it was 100 times better than sitting on a military tribunal and sending young men to the war who did not want to go. We never saw Hardy again, though he gave us a standing invitation to stay with him. From Dorchester we bicycled to Tiverton in Devonshire, where Nancy's old nurse kept a fancy goods shop. Nancy helped her dress the shop window and advised her about framing the prints which she was selling. She also gave the shop a good turnout, dusted the stock, and took her turn behind the counter. As a result of Nancy's work, the week's receipts went up several shillings and continued at the improved figure for a week or two after we were gone. This gave Nancy the idea of starting a shop herself on Boars Hill, a large residential district with no shop nearer than 3 miles away. We could buy a second-hand army hut, stock it with confectionery, groceries, tobacco, hardware, medicines, and all the other things that one finds in a village shop, run it tidily and economically, and make our fortune. I promised to help her while the vacation lasted. But army huts could not be bought at any reasonable price. The timber merchants were in a ring. So a local carpenter built a shop to Nancy's design. A neighbor rented us a corner of his field close to the road. The work got finished in good time, and we bought the stock. The Daily Mirror advertised the opening on its front page with the heading "Shopkeeping on Parnassus," and crowds came up from Oxford to look at us. We soon began to realize that it must either be a large general shop which made Boars Hill more or less independent of Oxford, and of the unsatisfactory system of vans calling at the door and bringing inferior foods with "take it or leave it," or a small sweet and tobacco shop that offered no challenge to the Oxford tradesmen. We decided on the challenge. The building had to be enlarged, and £200 or £300 worth of stock purchased. I used to serve in the shop several hours of the day, while Nancy went round to the big houses for the daily orders. Term had now begun, and I should have been attending lectures in Oxford. Another caricature scene. Myself, wearing a green baize apron, this time, with flushed face and disordered hair, selling a packet of Birds-Eye tobacco to the Poet Laureate with one hand, and with the other weighing out half a pound of brown sugar for Sir Arthur Evans's gardener's wife. Finally, the shop business ousted everything, not only Nancy's painting, but my university work, and Nancy's proper supervision of the house and children. We engaged a boy to call for orders, and soon had the custom of every resident on Boars Hill, except 2 or 3 dull wench. Even Mrs. Mansfield used to visit us once a week. She always bought the same tin of zinc powder and packet of soap flakes, paying money down from a cash box which she carried with her. The moral problems of trade interested me. Nancy and I both found it very difficult at this time of fluctuating prices to be really honest. We could not resist the temptation of undercharging the poor villagers of Watton, who were frequent customers, and recovering our money from the richer residents. Playing at Robin Hood came easily to me. Nobody ever detected the fraud. It was as easy as shelling peas, the boy said, who also took his turn behind the counter. We found that most people bought tea by price and not by quality. If we happened to be out of the tea, selling at 9 pence a quarter, which Mrs. So and so always bought, refusing the 8-penny tea, and if Mrs. So and why so asked for it in a hurry, we used to make up a pound of the 7-penny, which was the same color as the 9-penny, and charge it at 9 pence. The difference would not be noticed. We felt sorry for commercial travelers who sweated up the hill with their heavy bags of samples, usually on foot, and had to be sent away without any order. They would pitch a hard-luck tale, and often we relented and got in more stock than we needed. In gratitude, they would tell us some of the tricks of the trade, advising us, for instance, never to cut cheese or bacon exactly to weight, but to make it an ounce or 2 more and overcharge for this extra piece. There's few can do the sum before you take the stuff off the scales, and there's fewer still who take the trouble to weigh up again when they get back home. Until the shop lasted 6 months. Prices began falling at the rate of about 5% every week. The stock on our shelves had depreciated greatly in value. We had let several of the Wotton villagers run up bad debts. Then I went down with influenza, at the same time as Nancy quarreled with the nurse and had to take the house and children herself. When we came to reckon things up, we decided to cut our losses, hoping to recoup the original expenditure, and even to be in pocket on the whole transaction, by selling the shop and goodwill to a large firm of Oxford grocers who wished to buy it as a branch establishment. Unfortunately, however, the site was not ours, and Mrs. Masefield prevailed on the landlord not to let any ordinary business firm take over the shop from us, and thus spoil local amenities. No other site being available, we had to sell off what stock remained at bankruptcy prices to the wholesalers and find a buyer for the building. Unfortunately again, the building was not made in bolted sections to be re-erected elsewhere. It could be sold only as timber. And during these 6 months the corner and timber had also been broken and prices fallen steeply. We recovered £20 of the 200 that had been spent on it, but were some £500 in debt to the wholesalers and others. A lawyer took everything in hand for us and disposed of our assets, finally reducing the debt to some £300. Nicholson sent Nancy a £100 note in a matchbox as his contribution, and Lawrence unexpectedly contributed the remainder. He gave me 4 chapters of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom to sell for serial publication in the United States. As a point of honor, Lawrence refused to make any money out of the revolt, even in the most indirect way, but if it could help a poet in difficulties, he saw no harm in that. We gave the Masefields notice that the cottage would be free by the end of the June quarter 1921, but did not have any idea where to go or what to do next. It seemed clear that we must get another cottage somewhere, live quietly, look after the children ourselves, and try to make what money we needed by writing and drawing. Nancy, who had taken charge of everything while I was ill, now set me the task of getting the cottage. It must be found in 3 weeks' time. I protested. But you know there isn't a single cottage for rent anywhere. Yes, but we simply have to get one. All right then, describe it in detail. Since there are no cottages, we might as well get a no cottage that we really like. Is all? Well, it must have 6 rooms, water indoors, a beamed attic, a walled-in garden, and it must be near the river. It must be in a village with shops and yet a little removed from the village. The village must lie 5 or 6 miles from Oxford in the opposite direction from Boar's Hill. The church must have a tower and not a spire. I've always hated spires. And we can afford only 10 shillings a week unfurnished. Yeah, one me. I took down other details about soil, sanitation, windows, stairs, and kitchen sinks, laid a ruler across the Oxford Ordnance map, and found 5 riverside villages which corresponded in general direction and distance with Nancy's stipulation. Of these 5 villages, 2 proved on inquiry to possess shops, and of these 2, one had a towered church, and the other a spired church. I went to a firm of house agents in Oxford and asked, "Have you any cottages to let unfurnished?" The clerk laughed politely. "What I want is a cottage just outside the village of Islip, with a walled garden, 6 rooms, water in the house, a beamed attic, and at a rent of 10 shillings a week." "Oh, you mean the World's End Cottage. But that's for sale, not for rent. However, it's failed to find a buyer for 2 years, so perhaps the owner will let it go now at £500, which is only half of what he originally asked." The next day, Nancy came to Islip with me. She looked around and said, "Yes, this is the cottage all right, but I shall have to cut down the cypress trees and change those window panes. We'll move in on quarter day." "But the money." "We haven't the money." Nancy answered, "If we could find the exact house, surely we can find a mere lump sum of money?" She was right. My mother very kindly bought the cottage for £500 and let it to us at 10 shillings a week. 29. My mother, In letting us the Islip house, put a clause in the agreement that it must be used as a residence only, and not for the carrying on of any trade or business. She wanted to guard herself against any further commercial enterprise on our part, but need not have worried. We had learned our lesson. Islip, an agricultural village, lay far enough from Oxford not to be contaminated with the roguery for which the outskirts of most university towns are notorious. The policeman led an easy life. During the 4 years we lived there, nothing of ours was ever stolen, and no Islip cottager cheated or offended us. Once, by mistake, I left my bicycle at the station for 2 days, and when I recovered it, not only were both lamps, the pump, and the repair outfit still in place, but an anonymous friend had even cleaned it. Every Saturday during the winter months I played football for the village team. We ex-soldiers reintroduced the game at Islip after a lapse of some 80 years. The village nonagenarian complained that football was not so manly now as in his boyhood. He pointed across the fields to a couple of aged willow trees. Them used to be our home goals, he said. T'other pair stood half a mile upstream. Constables stopped our play in the end. 3 men were killed in the last game. 1 kicked to death. 2 other drowned each other in a scrimmage. Her was a grand game. I found Islip football, though not unmanly, ladylike by comparison with the Charterhouse game. When playing center forward, I often got booed for charging the goalkeeper as he fumbled with the shot he had saved. The cheers were reserved for my inside left, who spent most of his time stylishly dribbling the ball in circles round and round the field until robbed of it. He seldom went anywhere near the goal. But the football club was democratic, unlike the cricket club. I played cricket the first season but resigned because the team seldom consisted of the best 11 men available. Regular players would be dropped to make room for visiting gentry. Nancy and I did all the work ourselves, including the washing. I undertook the cooking. She made and mended the children's clothes. We shared the other chores. Catherine was born in 1922, and Sam in 1924. By the end of 1925, we had lived for 8 successive years in an atmosphere of teething, minor accidents, epidemics, and perpetual washing of babies' napkins. I did not dislike this sort of life, except for the money difficulties and almost never getting away to London. Love in a cottage, I'm afraid, had been the prophetic phrase current at our wedding. The strain told on Nancy, who was constantly ill, and I often had to take charge of everything. She tried to draw, but by the time she got her materials together, some alarm from the nursery would always disturb her. At last she decided not to start again until all the children were house-trained and old enough for school. I kept on with my work because the responsibility for making money rested with me, and because nothing has ever stopped me writing. Nancy and I kept the cottage clean in a routine that left us little leisure for anything else. We had accumulated a number of brass ornaments and utensils that needed polishing, and our children wore 5 times as many clean dresses as the neighbors' children did. I worked through constant interruptions. I could recognize the principal varieties of babies' screams: hunger, indigestion, wetness, pins, boredom, wanting to be played with, and learned to disregard all but the more important ones. Most of my prose books published in those 4 years betray the conditions under which I wrote. They are scrappy, not properly considered, and obviously written out of reach of a reference library. Poetry alone did not suffer. When working at a poem in my head, I went on doing my mechanical tasks in a trance until I had time to sit down and record it. At one period, I could allow myself only half an hour's writing a day, and then had to scribble hard in an effort to disburden my mind. I never sat chewing a pen. My poetry writing has always been a painful process of continual corrections on top of corrections, and persistent dissatisfaction. The children were all healthy and gave us little trouble. Nancy had strong views about giving them no meat or tea but as much fruit as they wanted, putting them to bed early, making them rest in the afternoon. We did our best to avoid the of our own childhood, but when they went to the village school, we could not protect them from formal religion, class snobbery, political prejudice, and mystifying fairy stories of the facts of sex. Islip seemed as good a place as any for the happy childhood that we wanted them to have. They had fields to play in, and animals all around, and playfellows of their own age. The river was close, and we could borrow a canoe. They even liked school. The villagers called me the captain. Otherwise, I had few reminders of the war, except my yearly visit to the Standing Medical Board. The board continued for some years to recommend me for a disability pension. My particular disability was neurasthenia. The train journey and the first-class Army railway warrant filled out with my rank and regiment usually produced reminiscential neurasthenia by the time I reached the board. Ex-servicemen were continually coming to the door, selling bootlaces and asking for cast-off shirts and socks. We always gave them a cup of tea and money. Islip was a convenient halt between the Chipping Norton and the Oxford workhouses. One day, an out-of-work ex-serviceman, a steamroller driver by trade, called with his 3 children, including a baby. Their mother had recently died in childbirth. We felt very sorry for them, and Nancy offered to adopt the eldest child, Daisy, who was about 13 years old and her father's greatest anxiety. She undertook to train Daisy in housework, so that she would be able later to go into service. The steamroller man shed tears of gratitude, and Daisy, a big, ugly girl, strong as a horse and toughened by her 3 years on the roads, seemed happy enough to be a member of the family. Nancy made her new clothes, we cleaned her, bought her shoes and gave her a bedroom. The steamroller man wanted Daisy to continue her education, which had been interrupted by their wanderings. But the schoolmistress put Daisy into the baby class, and the bigger girls used to tease her. In return, she pulled their hair and thumped them and learned to hate school. After a while, she grew homesick for the road. That was a good life, she used to say. Dad and me, and my brother, and the baby. The baby was a blessing. When I fetched him along to the back doors, I nearly always won something. Course, I was artful. If they tried to slam the door in my face, I used to put my foot in it and say, "This is my little orphan brother." Then I used to look around, and anything I seen I used to ask for. I used to ask for a pram for the baby, if I seen an old one in a shed, and I'd get it too. Course, we had a pram, really, a good one, and then we'd sell the pram I'd won in the next town we come to. Good beggars always ask for something particular, something they seen lying about. It's no good asking for food or money. I used to pick up a lot for my dad. I was a better beggar nor he was, he said. We used to go along singing on the road to anywhere. And there was always the Spikes to go to when the weather got bad. They was very good to us there. The Spike at Chippy Norton was our winter home. We used to go to the movies once a week there. We had fine grub at Chippy. We been all over the country, Wales and Devonshire, right up to Scotland, but we always come back to Chippy. Oh! Nancy and I were shocked one day when a tramp came to the door and Daisy slammed it in his face and told him to clear out of it. Nosy. And don't poke your ugly mug into respectable people's houses. She went on. I know you. Nosy Williams. You and your service papers what you pinched from a bloke down in Salisbury? And them bigamy charges against you, eh? Waiting down at Plymouth. Hop it now, quick, or I'll run for the cop. Ah. Daisy told us the true stories of many of the beggars we had befriended. There's not one decent man in 10 among them bums, she said. My dad's the only decent one of the lot. The reason most of them is on the road is the cops have something against them, so they has to keep moving. Course my dad don't like the life. He took to it too late. And my mom was very respectable too. She kept us clean. Most of them bums is lousy, with nasty diseases, and they keeps out of the Spike as much as they can, 'cause they don't like the carbolic baths. I know why. Daisy stayed with us for a whole winter. When spring came, and the roads dried, her father called for her again. He couldn't manage the little ones without her, he said. That was the last we saw of Daisy, though she wrote once from Chipping Norton asking us for money. My government grant and college exhibition had ended at the time we moved to Islip. Peace brought a slump in the sale of poetry, and our total income, counting birthday and Christmas checks from relatives, now amounted to £130 a year, of which perhaps half came from my writing. As Nancy reminded me, this meant 50 shillings a week, and some farm laborers at Islip, with more children than ourselves, earned only 30 shillings. They lived a much harder life than we did, and had no one to fall back on in case of sudden illness or other emergency. We used to get holidays, too, at Harlech, when my mother would insist on paying the train fare as well as giving us our board free. Thinking how difficult conditions were for the laborers' wives kept Nancy permanently depressed. We still called ourselves socialists, and when a branch of the Parliamentary Labour Party was formed in the village, lent the cottage for its weekly meetings throughout the winter months. Islip, though a rich agricultural area, had a reputation for slut farming. Mr. Wise, a farm laborer, one of our members, once heckled a speaker in the Conservative interest about a protective duty imposed by the Conservative government on dried currant. The speaker answered patronizingly, "Well, surely a duty on Greek currants won't hurt you working men at Islip. You don't grow currants in these parts, do you?" "Oh. No, sir," replied Mr. Wise. "The farmer's main crop hereabouts is squitch." I did sorry shy. They persuaded me to stand for the parish council, of which I became a member for a year. I wish now I had taken records of the smothered antagonism at the council meetings. There were 7 members, with 3 representatives of labor and 3 conservative representatives of the farmers and gentry. The chairman was a liberal, whom we supported as a generous employer, and the only farmer for miles around with training at an agricultural college. He held the balance very fairly. The council nearly came to blows over a proposed application to the district council for the building of new cottages. Many returned ex-soldiers who wanted to marry had nowhere to live with their wives. The conservative members opposed this application because it would mean a penny on the rates. Then there was the question of getting a recreation ground for the village. The football team did not wish to be dependent on the generosity of a big farmer who rented it to us at a nominal fee. The Conservatives opposed this plan, again in the interest of the rates, and pointed out that shortly after the armistice, the village had turned down a recreation ground scheme, preferring to spend the memorial subscription money on a synod. The Labour members replied that the vote was taken, as at the 1918 general election, before the soldiers could return to express their views. Nasty innuendos were then aimed at farmers who had stayed at home and made their pile, while their laborers fought and bled. The chairman calmed the antagonists. Another caricature scene. Myself in corduroys and a rough frieze coat, sitting in the village schoolroom, this time with no evils of alcoholism around the walls, but nature drawings and mounted natural history specimens instead, debating, as an Oxfordshire village elder, whether or not Farmer Tompkins could use a footpath across the allotments as a bridle path, having first overturned the decayed style which, I urged, disproved his right. This association with the Labour Party severed our friendly relations with the village gentry, who had hitherto regarded us as in their camp. My mother had taken the trouble to call on the rector when she viewed the property, and he later asked me to speak from the chancel steps of the village church at a war memorial service. He suggested that I should read war poems, but instead of Rupert Brooke on the glorious dead, I read some of the more painful poems by Sassoon and Wilfred Owen about men dying from gas poisoning, and about buttocks of corpses bulging from the mud. I also suggested that the men who had died, destroyed as it were by the fall of the Tower of Siloam, were not particularly virtuous or particularly wicked, but just average soldiers, and that the survivors should thank God they were alive, and do their best to avoid wars in the future. Though the church party, apart from the liberal-minded rector, professed to be scandalized, the ex-servicemen had not been too well treated on their return, and liked to be told that they stood on equal terms with the glorious dead. They were modest men. I noticed that though respecting the king's desire to wear their campaign medals on this occasion, they kept them buttoned up inside their coats. The leading Labourite at Islip was William Beckley, Sr. He bore an inherited title dating from the time of Oliver Cromwell, being always known as Fisher Beckley. A direct ancestor, fishing one day on the Cherwell during the siege of Oxford, had ferried Cromwell himself and a body of parliamentary troops over the river. In return, Cromwell granted him perpetual fishing rights from Islip to the stretch of river where the Cherwell Hotel now stands. The cavalry skirmish at Islip Bridge still remained fresh in local tradition, and a cottager at the top of the hill showed me a small stone cannonball, fired on this occasion and found stuck in his chimney stack. But even Cromwell came late in the history of the Beckley family. The Beckleys had been watermen on the river long before the 17th century. Indeed, Fisher Beckley knew by family tradition the exact spot in the riverbed where a barge lay, sunk while conveying stone for the building of Westminster Abbey before the Norman Conquest. Islip was the birthplace of Edward the Confessor, who had awarded the Islip lands to the abbey. They remained abbey property after 1,000 years. The abbey stone came from a quarry on the hillside close to the river. Our cottage stood on the old slipway down which the stone barges were launched. Sometime in the 1870s, American weed was introduced into the river and net fishing, at last, became impossible. Fisher Beckley turned agricultural laborer. His socialist views prevented him from getting employment in the village, so he daily trudged to a farm some miles away. But he was still Fisher Beckley, and for us cottagers the most respected man in Islip. 30. My parents were most disappointed when, because of the shop crisis and my illness, I failed to take the BA degree at Oxford. But Sir Walter Raleigh, as head of the English school, allowed me to sit for the later degree of Bachelor of Letters and present a written thesis on any subject I chose. He also agreed to be my tutor on condition that he should not be expected to tutor me. He thought well of my poetry and suggested that we should only meet as friends. Sir Walter was engaged at the time on the official history of the war in the air, and wanted practical flying experience for the task. The RAF took him up as often as he needed, but he caught typhoid fever on a flight out east and died. His death so saddened me that I did not apply for another tutor. I found it difficult to write my thesis. The illogical element in English poetry in the required academic style, and decided to make it an ordinary book. I rewrote it some 9 times and did not like the final result. I was trying to show the nature of the supra-logical element in poetry, which could only be fully understood. I wrote, by studying the latent associations of the words used, the obvious prose sense being often in direct opposition to the latent content. The book's weakness lay in its not clearly distinguishing between a poet's supralogical thought processes and the sublogical process of the common psychopath. I published a volume of poems every year from 1920 to 1925. After the Pier Glass, which appeared in 1921 when I made no attempt to please the ordinary reading public, and did not even flatter myself that I was conferring benefits on posterity. I had no reason to suppose that posterity would be more appreciative than my contemporaries. I never wrote unless a poem pressed to be written. Though assuming a reader of intelligence and sensibility, and envisaging his possible reactions to my words, I no longer identified him with any particular group of readers or, taking courage from Hardy, with critics of poetry. He was no more real a person than the conventional figure put in the foreground of an architectural design to indicate the size of a building. This greater strictness in writing, which showed in Whipperginny, laid me open to accusations of trying to get publicity and increase my sales by a willful clowning modernism. I made several attempts during these years to rid myself of the poison of war memories by finishing my novel, but had to abandon it, ashamed at having distorted my material with a plot, and yet not sure enough of myself to turn it back into undisguised history. As here, I knew most of the poets then writing. They included Walter de la Mare, W.A. H. L. Waring. I didn't tell you that. Davies T.S. Eliot, the Sitwells, and many more. I like Davies because he came from South Wales and was afraid of the dark, and because once I heard he made out a list of poets and crossed them off one by one as he decided that they were not true poets until only two names were left, his own and mine. He was very jealous of de la Mare and had bought a pistol with which he used to take pot shots at a photograph of de la Mare's on the upper landing of his house. But I liked de la Mare too for his gentleness and the hard work he obviously put into his poems. I was always interested in the writing technique of my fellow poet. I once asked whether he had not worried for hours over the lines. Ah, no man knows. Through what wild centuries roves back the rose, and, in the end, been dissatisfied. De la Mare ruefully admitted that he was forced to leave the assonants roves and rose because no synonym for roves seemed strong enough. In 1925, I agreed to collaborate with T.S. Eliot, then a harassed bank clerk, in a book about modern poetry to which we would each contribute essays, but the plan fell through. I seldom saw Osbert and Sacheverell Sitwell now. When I did, I always felt uncomfortably rustic in their society. One autumn, Osbert sent me a present of a brace of grouse. They came from Renishaw, the Derbyshire family seat, in a bag labeled, "With Captain Sitwell's compliment to Captain Graves." Nancy and I could neither of us face the task of plucking and gutting and roasting the birds, so we gave them to a neighbor. I wrote to Osbert, "Captain Graves acknowledges with thanks Captain Sitwell's gift of Captain Grouse, but we made friends with his sister Edith." It was a surprise after reading her wild avant-garde poems to find her gentle, domesticated, and even devout. When she came to stay with us, she spent her time sitting on the sofa and hemming handkerchiefs. She used to write to Nancy and me frequently, but our friendship ended in 1926. I met none of my surviving army friends, with the very occasional exception of Siegfried. Edmund Blunden had gone as professor of English literature to Tokyo. Lawrence enlisted in the RAF as soon as the Middle Eastern settlement went through, but a labor member gave notice of a question in the House about his presence there under an assumed name, and the Air Ministry dismissed him. He was now a private in the Royal Tank Corps and hating it. When Sir Walter Raleigh died, I felt my connection with Oxford University broken, and when Rivers died and George Mallory on Everest, the death of my friends seemed to be following me in peacetime as relentlessly as in war. A feeling of ill luck clouded these years. Islip had ceased to be a country refuge. I found myself resorting to the wartime technique of getting through things somehow, anyhow, in the hope that they would mend. Nancy's poor health led her to do less and less work. Our finances were improved by an allowance from her father that covered the extra expense of the new children. We now had £200 a year, but cottage life with 4 of them under 6 years old, and Nancy ill showed signs of palling. I might have, after all, had to violate my oath and take a teaching job. But for that I needed a degree, so I completed my thesis, which I published as Poetic Unreason, and handed it in already printed to the examining board. To my surprise, they accepted it, and now I had my B.Lit. degree. However, I did not want a preparatory or secondary school job, which would keep me away from home all day. Nancy could not bear having anyone else but myself, and her taking care of the children. There seemed no solution to my problem. Then the doctor told us that if Nancy wished to regain her health, she must spend the winter in Egypt. Thus, the only appointment that could possibly meet the case would be an independent teaching job in Egypt, at a very high salary, and with little work to do. A week or two later, this is how things have always happened in emergencies. I was invited to offer myself as a candidate for the post of Professor of English Literature at the newly founded Royal Egyptian University, Cairo. I had been recommended, I found out afterwards, by 2 or 3 influential men. Among them, Arnold Bennett, always a good friend to me, and the first critic who spoke out strongly for my poems in the daily press, and Lawrence, who had known Lord Lloyd, then High Commissioner of Egypt, during the Arab Revolt. The salary, including the passage money, amounted to £1,400 a year. I fortified these recommendations with others, from my neighbour, Colonel John Buchan, and from Mr. Asquith, now the Earl of Oxford, who had taken a fatherly interest in me and often visited our cottage at Islip. I got the appointment. The indirect proceeds from poem writing can be enormously higher than the direct ones. 31. So, second class by P&O to Egypt, with a nurse for the children, new clothes in the new cabin trunks, and a Morris Oxford in the hold. Lawrence had written to me. Egypt, being so near Europe, is not a savage country. The Egyptians, you need not dwell among. Indeed, it will be a miracle if an Englishman can get to know them. The bureaucrat society is exclusive, and lives smilingly unaware of the people, partly because so many foreigners come there for pleasure in the winter, and the other women who live there must be butterflies too, if they would consort with the visitors. I thought the salary attractive. It has just been raised. The work may be interesting or may be terrible, according to whether you get keen on it, like Lafcadio Hearn, or hate it, like a Robert Nichol. Even if you hate it, there will be no harm done. The climate is good, the country beautiful, the things admirable, the beings curious and disgusting, and you are stable enough not to be caught broadside by a mere dislike for your job. Execute it decently, as long as you draw the pay, and enjoy your free hours, plentiful in Egypt, more freely. Lloyd will be a good friend. Roam about, Palestine, the Sahara Oasis, the Red Sea province, Sinai, a jolly desert, the Delta swamps, Wilfred Jennings Bramley's buildings in the western desert, the divine mosque architecture of Cairo town. Yet, possibly, you will not dislike the job. I think the coin spins evenly. The harm to you is little, for the family will benefit by a stay in the warm. Cairo isn't warm in winter, and the job won't drive you into frantic excesses of rage. And the money will be useful. You should save a good bit of your pay after the expense of the first 6 months. I recommend the iced coffee at Grappi's. And so, my blessing, my elder brother Dick and my elder sister Molly had both been living in Egypt since I was a little boy. Dick, a leading government official, at a salary less than my own, and his wife viewed my arrival with justifiable alarm. They knew of my political opinions. But Molly, to whom I was devoted, had no suspicions and wrote a letter of most affectionate welcome. Siegfried came to see me off. "Do you know who's on board?" he asked. "The Twisted Image. He's still in the regiment, going out to join the 1st Battalion in India. Last time I saw him, he was sitting in the bottom of a dug, out gnawing a chunk of bully beef like a rat. The Twisted Image." His nickname referred to the biblical proposition that we are all created in the image of our Maker. Went to Copthorne School with me and won a scholarship at the same time as I did. We served at Wrexham and Liverpool together. He also was wounded with the 2nd Battalion at High Wood. And now we were traveling east together. We had absolutely nothing in common, even mutual dislike. So I saw no natural reason why we should have been thrown so often in each other's company. The ship touched at Gibraltar, where we disembarked, bought figs, and rode round the town. I remembered the cancelled War Office telegram and thought what a fool I had been to prefer Rill. Luckily, a P&O director, who happened to be aboard, persuaded the captain to take the ship within half a mile of Stromboli, then in eruption, by dusk in a hailstorm with the lava hissing into the sea. At port, said, a friend of my sister's helped us through the customs. I still felt sick, but knew that I was in the East because he began talking about Kipling and Kipling's Waddles of Leichenburg. and whether they were really wattles or some allied plant. Then on to Cairo, looking out of the windows all the way, delighted at summer fields in January. My sister-in-law advised us against the more exclusive residential suburb of Gizera, where she lived, so with her assistance we rented a flat at Heliopolis, a few miles east of Cairo. We found the cost of living very high, this being the tourist season, but reduced the grocery bill by taking advantage of the more reasonable prices at the British Army canteen, where I presented myself as an officer on the pension list. Our 2 Sudanese servants, contrary to all warnings about the natives, were temperate, punctual, respectful, and never, to my knowledge, stole a thing beyond the remains of a single joint of mutton. It seemed queer, no longer looking after the children, or doing housework, and wonderful to have as much time as I needed for my work. The university was founded by King Fuad, who wished to be known as a patron of the arts and sciences. The Cairo University before this one had been nationalistic in its policy and, because not staffed with European experts or supported by the government, soon came to an end. King Fuad's university began ambitiously. Faculties of science, medicine, and letters, and a full complement of highly paid professors, few of them Egyptians. The medicine and science faculties were predominantly English, but the appointments to the Faculty of Letters had been made in the previous summer, when the British High Commissioner went on holiday, else he would no doubt have discountenanced them as being predominantly French and Belgian. Only one of my colleagues could speak English, and none had any knowledge of Arabic. Yet of the 200 Egyptian students, mostly sons of rich merchants and landowners, fewer than 20 knew more than a smattering of French, just enough for shopping purposes in the elegant stores, though every one of them had learned English in the secondary schools. All official university correspondence was conducted in classical Arabic, which admits no word of later date than Muhammad's time. Not that I should have noticed any neologisms myself. The very learned Sheikh Graves, as I was there described, used to take his handouts to the post office for interpretation. My 12 or 13 French colleagues were men of the highest academic distinction, but 2 or 3 English village schoolmasters would have gladly undertaken their work at 1/3 of their salaries, and done it far better. The university building, a former harem palace of the Khedive, was built in luscious French style with mirrors and gilding. British officials at the Ministry of Education begged me to keep the British flag flying in the Faculty of Letters. I assented. Though I had not come to Egypt as an ambassador of empire, it irked me to let the French indulge in semi-political activities at my expense. The dean, M. Grégoire, was an authority on Slav poetry, tough, witty, and capable. He had acquired a certain slyness and adaptability during the war when, as a Belgian civilian in the German occupation, he edited an underground publication. The one-legged professor of French literature, a war hero, patronized me at first. I was his young friend rather than his dear colleague. But when he learned that I also had bled in the cause of civilization in France, I became his most esteemed chum. The Frenchman lectured with the help of Arabic interpreters, which made neither for speed nor for accuracy. I should have delivered 2 lectures a week. The dean, however, soon decided that if the students were ever to dispense with the interpreters, they must be given special instruction in French, and this reduced the time for lectures, so that he could allow me only 1 a week. That one was pandemonium. The students were not hostile, merely excitable and anxious to show their regard for me and liberty and Zaghloul Pasha, and the well-being of Egypt, all at the same time. They obliged me to shout at the top of my loudest barrack square voice, which I had learned to pitch high for greater carrying power, in order to restore silence. No textbooks of any sort were available, the university library having no English department, and it took months to get books through the French librarian. This was January, and the students faced an examination in May. They professed themselves anxious to master Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and Byron in that time. I had no desire to teach Wordsworth and Byron to anyone, and wished to protect Shakespeare from them. Deciding to lecture on the most rudimentary forms of literature possible, I chose the primitive ballad and its development into epic and the drama. I might at least, perhaps, teach them the meaning of the simpler literary terms. But though they had taken English for 8 years or so in the schools, I could not count on their understanding half what I told them. Nobody, for instance, when I spoke of a ballad maker singing to his harp, knew what a harp looked like. I told them that it was what King David played upon, and drew a picture on the blackboard, at which they shouted, "Oh, a newer!" I had myself seen a communal ballad, group in action, at the hind legs of the Sphinx, while a gang of fellaheen cleared away the sand. One of the gang acted as chanty man to keep the others moving, but my students thought it beneath their dignity to admit the existence of ballads in Egypt. The fellaheen did not exist in their eyes, except as lazy and rather disgusting animals. Printed notes of my lectures, with which to prepare for the examinations, were much in demand. I asked the clerical staff of the faculty to duplicate some of them, but they were kept too busy by the French professors, and in spite of promises, never got the job done. My lectures soon degenerated into lecture notes for lectures that could not be given, but at any fate, I kept the students busy scribbling in their notebooks. My wide trousers, the first Oxford bags to reach Egypt, interested them profoundly, their own being still the peg-top sort, narrow at the ankles. Soon, everyone who was anyone wore Oxford bags. One evening, the rector of the university asked me to dinner. 2 of my students, sons of ministers, happened also to be invited. For fun, I was wearing white silk socks with my evening dress. Afterwards, I heard from the vice-rector, Ali Bey Omar, whom I like best of the university officials, that a day or 2 later, he had seen the same students wearing white silk socks at a government banquet. When they looked round on the distinguished assembly, they found they were so far in advance of fashion as to be the only white socks present. Ali Bey Omar gave a pantomime account of how, in embarrassment, they tried to loosen their braces surreptitiously and stroked down their trousers. For some weeks I missed even my single weekly lecture because the students went on strike. This was Ramadan, when they had to fast for a month between sunrise and sunset. Between sunset and sunrise they ate rather more than usual to make up, a tax on the digestive processes which affected their nerves. The pretext for striking was the intensive French instruction, but really they wanted leisure to cram for the examination at home. Then the blind professor of Arabic, one of the few Egyptians with fame as an Orientalist, published a book calling attention to pre-Islamic sources of the Quran. His lectures demanded greater mental effort than any of the rest, so when the examinations were held, most students absented themselves from the Arabic paper on religious grounds. To an Orthodox Muslim, the Quran, since dictated by God to Muhammad, could have no pre-Islamic sources. I came to know only 2 of my students fairly well, a Greek and a Turk. The Turk was rich, intelligent, good-natured, perhaps 20 years old, and twice took me for a drive to the pyramids in his motor car. He spoke both French and English fluently, being almost the only student, except for 12 who had attended a French Jesuit college with this facility. He apologized one day for having to miss my lecture. He was about to be married. I asked whether this would be the first or second part of the ceremony. He said, "The first. I will not be allowed to see my wife's face, because her family is Orthodox. That must wait until the second ceremony." But his sister, he explained, had been at school with the girl and told him that she was pretty and a good sort. Also, his father respected her father. When the second ceremony took place, he confessed to perfect satisfaction. I learned that the bridegroom seldom refused the bride when she lifted her veil, though he had the right to do so, and she had a similar right. Usually, the couple contrived to meet before even the first ceremony. The girl would slip the man a note saying, "I shall be at Maison Sicurel by the hat counter about 3:30 tomorrow afternoon, if you want to know what I look like. It will be quite in order for me to lift my veil, as I try on a hat. You can recognize me by my purple parasol. I inquired about the rights of Muslim women in Egypt. Apparently, divorce was simple. The man had only to declare in the presence of a witness, I divorce you, and that did it. On the other hand, she could recover her original dowry, plus the interest accrued on it during her married life. Dowries were always heavy and divorces comparatively rare. The gentry considered it very low class to keep more than one wife, unless she behaved so badly that the husband decided to shame her by taking another. I heard of an Egyptian who got angry with his wife one morning because the breakfast coffee came in cold. He shouted, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. Oh, my dear, she exclaimed. Now you've done it. The servants heard what you said. I must go back to my father with my 10,000 pounds and my 60 camels. He apologized for his hasty temper. Light of my eyes, we must get remarried as soon as possible. She reminded him that the law prevented them from marrying again unless another marriage had intervened. So he called in the aged man who watered the lawn and ordered him to marry her, but it must be a marriage of form only. The obedient gardener did as he was told and, immediately after the ceremony, returned to his watering pot. 2 days later, the woman got run over by a taxi, so the gardener inherited the money and the camels. The Greek invited me to tea once. He had 3 beautiful sisters named Pallas, Aphrodite, and Artemis, who gave me tea in their garden with European cakes that they had learned to make at the American college. Next door, a pale-faced man stood on a 3rd-floor balcony addressing the world. I asked Pallas what his speech was about. Oh, she laughed. Don't mind him. He's a mad millionaire, so the police leave him alone. He lived 10 years in England. He's saying now that they're burning him up with electricity and telling the birds all his troubles. Also, that his secretary accuses him of stealing 5 piastres. But it isn't true, and that there can't be a God because God wouldn't allow the English to steal the Fellahine's camels for the war and not return them. Now he's saying that all religions are very much the same, and that Buddha is as good as Mohammed. Really, he's quite mad. He keeps a little dog in his house, actually in his very room, plays with it, and talks to it as though it were a human being. Pallas told me that in another 20 years the women of Egypt would control everything. The feminist movement had just started, and since the women were by far the most active and intelligent part of the population, great changes might be expected. Neither she nor her sisters would stand her father's attempt to keep them in their places. Her brother, who was doing the literature course as a preliminary to law, showed me his library. Besides his legal textbooks, he had Voltaire, Rousseau, a number of saucy French novels in paper covers, Shakespeare's works, and Samuel Smiles' self-help. When he asked my advice about his career, I suggested a European university. A literary degree at Cairo would be worth little, unless he wanted to take up politics. I had not realized before just how much the British controlled Egypt. Egypt ranked as an independent kingdom, but it seemed that I owed my principal allegiance not to King Fuad, who had given me my appointment and paid my salary, but to the High Commissioner, whose infantry, cavalry, and air squadrons were a constant reminder of his power. British officials could not understand the Egyptians' desire for independence, considering them most ungrateful for all the beneficent labor and skill applied to their country since the 80s, raising it from bankruptcy to riches. There was no Egyptian nation, I was assured. The Greeks, Turks, Syrians, and Armenians who called themselves Egyptians had no more right there than the British. Before the British occupation, the Pashas used to bleed the Fellahin white, and it was not the Fellahin, the only true Egyptians, who now called for freedom. Nationalism, a creed derived from the new smatterings of Western education we were giving the upper classes, should be disregarded as merely a symptom of the country's growing wealth. The reduction of the British official class in the last few years was viewed with disgust. We did all the hard work, and when we go everything will run down. It's running down already. and they'll have to call us back, or if not, the day goes, and we don't see why they should benefit. None of them realized how much the vanity of the Egyptians, probably the vainest people in the world, was hurt by the constant sight of British uniform. On the other hand, I could not suppose that the morale of the Egyptian soldier would be very high in time of war. Having seen one of their officers, incensed by the negligence of a sentry, pull open the man's mouth and spit into it. Egypt had come to consider itself a European nation, but at the same time attempted to supplant Turkey as the leading power of Islam. This led to many anomalies. On the same day that my students staged their protest against the professor of Arabic's irreligious views, the students of El-Azhar, the great Cairo Theological College, refused to wear the prescribed Arab dress of kaftan and silk head dress and appeared in European clothes and tarbouch. The tarbouch was the national hat which even British officials wore. I myself owned one. It would have been difficult to find a hat more unsuitable for the climate. Being red, it attracted the heat of the sun, got very stuffy inside, and had no brim to protect the neck against sunstroke. My brother Dick behaved beautifully to me, as he has always done, and so did my romantic sister Molly, who is a water diviner and, by my advice, always wears a beauty patch on her right cheekbone. Her adoring husband, Judge Preston of the Mixed Courts, found himself greatly embarrassed at the Turf Club, which I refused to join for fear of involving Nancy in social calls from the wives of British officials. When she claimed that her son, Martin, who closely resembled him in no features, was a parthenogenous birth. One day, Molly asked me about my confirmation. I told her that the Bishop of Zululand performed the ceremony, and she gave me a rapturous hug. "Darling," she said, "I knew we had lots in common. I was confirmed by the Bishop of Zanzibar." 32. I did 2 useful pieces of educational work in Egypt. I ordered a consignment of standard text books of English literature for the faculty library at the university, and I acted as examiner to the diploma class of the higher training college, which provided English teachers for the primary and secondary schools. I have kept 3 diploma essays as a memento, the first by one Mahmud Muhammad Muhammad. Environment as a factor in evolution. This is the story of evolutions. Once it was thought that the Earth's crust was caused by catastrophes, but when Darwin came into the world and had a good deal of philosophy, he said, all different kinds of species differ gradually as we go backwards, and there's no catastrophes. And if we apply the fact upon previous predecessors, we reach simpler and simpler predecessors, until we reach the nature. Man, also, is under the evolutions. None can deny this if he could deny the sun in daylight. A child from the beginning of his birthday possesses instincts like to suckle his food from the mammal of his mother and many others. But he is free of habits and he is weak as anything. Then he is introduced into a house and usually finds himself among parents, and his body is either cleansed or left to the dirts. This shows his environment. Superficial thinkers are apt to look on environment as at best, a trifle motive in bringing up a. But learned men believe that a child born in the presence of some women who say a bad word, this word, as believed by them, remains in the brain of the child until it ejects. Environment quickly supplies modification. The life of mountainous goats leads them to train themselves on jumping. The camel is flat-footed with hoofs for the sand. Some kind of cattle were wild in the past, but lived in plain lands and changed into gentle sheep. The frog, when young, has her tail and nostrils like a fish, suitable for life at sea, but changing her environment, the tail decreased. The sea is broad and changeable, so those who live at sea are changeable and mysterious. Put a cow in a dirty, damp place, and she will become more and more slender until she die. Also horses. Horse had 5 fingers on his legs, but now one only from running for water in the draft. Climate also affects bodily habits of the dear Europeans who live in Egypt. They who were smart and patient and strong with a skin worth the name of weather, proof became also fatigable and fond of leisure. From the theory we learned that human beings should be improved like the beasts by creating healthy youngs and by good frugal education. The next essay is one written by Mohammed Mahmud Mohammed, the character of Lady Macbeth. Sir, to write shortly, Lady Macbeth was brave and venturesome, but she had no tact. She says to Macbeth, "Now the opportunity creates itself, lose it not. Where's your manlyhood in these suitable circumstances? I have children, and I know the love of a mother's heart. But you must know I would dash the child's head and drive away the boneless teeth which are milking me, rather than to give a promise and then leave it." Macbeth says, "But we may fail." "Fail?" says LM, "but stick to the point and we will not fail. Leave the rest to me. I shall put drugs in the groom's drink and we shall excuse." Macbeth says, "You are fit to lay men children only." The impression on the reader becomes very great and fills with anger. The last essay is by one Mahmud Muhammad Mohammed. The best use of leisure time. Leisure time is a variety to tireful affairs. God Almighty created the universe in 6 days and took a rest in the 7th. He wished to teach us the necessity of leisure time. Man soon discovered by experience that all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. But this leisure time may be dangerous and ill-used if the mind will not take its handle and move it wisely to different directions. Many people love idleness. It is a great prodigality which leads to ruin. Many Egyptians spend their times in cafes longing for women and tracking them with their eyes, which corrupts and pollutes manners. They are perplexed and annoyed by the length of daytime. Others try to rest through gambling, which is the scourge of society and individual. But let us rather enjoy external nature, the beautiful leafy trees, the flourishing fields, and the vast lawns of green grass starred with myriad of flowers of greater or small size. There the birds sing and build their nests, the meandering canals flow with fresh water, and the happy peasants, toiling afar from the multitude of town life, purify the human wishes from personal stain. Also, museums are instructive. It is quite wrong to keep to usual work and fatigable studies, but quite right to free our minds from the web of worldly affairs in which they are entangled. Yes, let us with the lark leave our beds to enjoy the cool breeze before sunrise. Let us, when the lazy or luxurious are snoring or sunk in their debaucheries, sit under the shady trees and meditate. We can think of God, the river, and the moon, and enjoy the reading of Gray's Elegy to perfection. We shall brush the dews on the lawn at sunrise, for a country life is sweat, in moderate cold and heat. Or we may read the best companions, books full of honorable passions, wise moral and good pathos. Reading maketh a full man, nobody will deny bake. Or we may easily get a musical instrument at little price. Every schoolboy knows that music is a moral law which gives a soul to the universe. Criminals can be cured by the sweet power of music. The whale came up from the dark depths of the sea to carry the Greek musician, because it was affected by the sweet harmonies which hold a mirror up to nature. Are we not better than the whale? Also, gymnastic clubs are spread everywhere. Why do a youth not pass his leisure time in widening his chest? Because a sound mind is in a sound body. Yet it is a physiological fact that the blacksmith cannot spend his leisure time in striking iron or the soldier in military exercises. The blacksmith may go to see the Egyptian exhibition, and the soldier may go to the sea to practice swimming, or to the mountains to know its caves in order that he may take shelter from a fierce enemy in time of war. Milton knew the best uses of leisure time. He used to sit to his books reading and to his music playing, and so put his name among the immortals. That was the case of Byron, Napoleon, Addison, and Palmerston. And if a man is unhappy, says an ancient philosopher, it is his own fault. He can be happy if his leisure time brings profit and not disgrace. I decided to resign. So did the professor of Latin, my only English colleague, and the one-legged professor of French literature, who was an honest man. The others stayed on. The Egyptians treated me hospitably. I attended one heavy banquet at the Semiramis Hotel, given by the Ministry of Education. Tall Sudanese waiters, dressed in red robes, served a succession of the most magnificent dishes I had seen anywhere, even on the films. They included a great model of the Cairo Citadel in ice, its doors and windows filled with caviar. We used a golden Moorish spoon to scoop this out. Someone told me recently that this banquet, which must have cost thousands, has not yet been paid for. I found little to do in Egypt, not having Lawrence's appetite for desert travel, but eat coffee ices at Groppi's, visit the open-air cinemas, and sit at home in our flat at Heliopolis, and get on with writing. Molly, who lived near, continued sisterly. During the season of the Khamsin, a hot wind that sent the temperature up on one occasion to 113 degrees in the shade, I put the finishing touches to a small book called Lars Porsena, or The Future of Swearing in Improper Language. The best thing I saw in Egypt was the noble face of old Pharaoh Seti, the good, unwrapped of its mummy cloths, at the Cairo Museum. The funniest thing was a French bedroom farce at a native theater played in Arabic by Syrian actors. The men and women of the cast had, for religious reasons, to keep on opposite sides of the stage. They sang French songs, in translation, varying the tunes with the quarter tones and shrieks and trills of their own music. The audience talked all the time and ate peanuts, oranges, sunflower seeds, and heads of lettuces. I went to call on Lord Lloyd at the end of May, just before the close of the academic year. Soon after, he invited me to dine at the Residency. I won 20 piastres off him at bridge and was told, "Collect it from my ADC," but felt that a loser should decently dip into his own trouser pocket to pay card debts, so let the money go. Lloyd believed in his job more than I did in mine. When he asked me how I found Egypt, I answered, "All right," with an intonation that made him catch me up quickly. Only all right. Nothing more passed between us. He used to drive through Cairo at about 60 miles an hour, in a powerful car with a Union Jack flying from it, and motor. Cyclist outriders to clear the way. For Thurley Stack, the Sirdar, had been killed in the previous year while driving through the city, and a traffic jam had materially helped his assassins. One day, a student showed me the spot near the Ministry of Education where it happened. At first, I took the crowd gathered there for a party of political sightseers, but the attraction proved to be a stark naked woman lying on the pavement, laughing wildly and waving her arms, one of the hashish dope cases then very common in Egypt. The crowd was jeering at her. A policeman standing a few yards off paid no heed. I attended a levee at the Abdin Palace, King Fuad's Cairo residence. It began at 9 o'clock in the morning. The king gave honorable precedence to the university staff. We came in soon after the diplomatic corps and the ministers of the crown, and some time before the army. While still in England, I had bought suitable clothes, a morning coat and trousers, for this occasion. To be really correct, my coat should have been faced with green silk, the national color of Egypt, but I was told that this would not be insisted upon. Opinions differed greatly as to what constituted correct court dress. Most of the French professors arrived in full evening dress, with swallowtail coats, white waistcoats, and opera hats. A few ordinary dinner jackets. All wore decorations around their necks. They looked like stragglers from an all-night fancy dress ball. After signing my name in the two large hotel registers, one belonging to the king and the other to the queen, I drank a refreshing and horribly sweet rice drink, by courtesy of the queen, and mounted the noble marble staircase. On every second step stood an enormous Nubian soldier, royally uniformed with a lance in his hand. My soldiers' eye admired their physique, but deprecated their somewhat listless attitudes. Still, no doubt, they pulled themselves smartly to attention as the Egyptian Army General Staff went past. My brother had warned me that, on meeting King Fuad, I must not be surprised at anything extraordinary I heard. A curious wheezing cry was apt to burst from his throat occasionally when he felt nervous. During his childhood, the family had been shot up by an assassin in the employ of interested relatives, but little Fuad took cover under a table and, though wounded, survived. We moved from room to room. At last, a quiet Turkish-looking gentleman of middle age, wearing regulation court dress, greeted us deferentially in French. I took him for the Grand Chamberlain. I bowed, said the same thing in French as the professor in front of me, and expected to be led along to the throne room. However, the next stage was the exit. I had already met King Fuad. A few days later, I attended a royal soirée, an Italian variety show. King Fuad had been educated in Italy, where he attained the rank of cavalry captain and learned a great regard for Italian culture. The performance belonged to the 1870s. A discreet blonde shepherdess did a hopping dance in ankle-length skirts, and a discreet tenor confined his passion to the top notes, and a well-behaved comedian made nice little jokes for the queen. I clapped him for having done his unsuccessful best to raise a laugh, but everybody glared round. An official whispered to me that, this being a command performance, the actors were entitled to no applause. Unless His Majesty professed himself amused, the turns must be greeted in silence. I wore court dress again, but, not to be outdone by the Frenchmen, had put on my 3 campaigning medals, and regretted that I lost St. Anne of the 3rd class with the crossed swords. And those refreshments! I shall not attempt to describe the Arabian Nights buffet, so splendid that it has remained a mere blur in my memory. I pocketed some quite fantastic confections to bring home. Our children had to drink boiled milk and boiled water and be constantly watched in case they took off their solar topis and blue veils. Then they all got measles, so were carried off to an isolation hospital and fed on the things that we had been particular since their birth never to give them. And the native nurses stole their toys. They returned thin and wretched-looking. Sam, the baby, with permanently scarred eardrums, and we wondered if we should ever get them safely home to England. We booked our passages sometime at the end of May, but even after selling the car, had only just enough money left to go 3rd class on a small Italian boat with a cargo of onions. We disembarked at Venice and stopped a day. After Egypt, Venice seemed like heaven. We ate European eggs there for breakfast. Egyptian eggs were about the size of a pigeon's egg, and always tasted strongly of the garlic, which seemed to form a large part of the Egyptian fowl's diet. Egypt gave me plenty of caricature scenes to look back on. For instance, myself wearing a smart yellow gabardine suit and seated at a long baize-covered table in the faculty conference room. Before me, a cup of Turkish coffee, a solar topi, and a badly typed French record of the minutes of the last meeting. I am talking angry bad French at my Belgian and French colleagues in support of the young professor of Latin, who has just leaped to his feet, pale with hatred. He is declaring in worse French that he positively refuses to make a forced contribution of 50 piastres to a memorial wreath for one of the Frenchmen who had just died, since he was never consulted. I am declaring that neither will I, and that, since the dean has made a point of excluding us from the previous meetings where he took decisions affecting our lectures, all dead French professors can go bury themselves at their own expense. It is a lofty, elegant room, once a harem boudoir. A portrait of the Khedive, with a large rent in it, hangs crookedly at one end. At the other stands a large glass showcase, full of Egypto-Roman bronze coins, muddled together, their labels loose, and the glass cracked. Through the window, market gardens, buffaloes, camels loaded with green fodder, country women in black. Around the table, my horrified, shrugging colleagues, turning to one another and saying, "Inouï, inouï." And outside, the rebellious shouts of our students, working themselves up for another strike. The rest makes no more than conversation. Of the government clerk, who was so doubly unfortunate as to be run over by a racing car, and then recognized the driver as the eldest son of the Minister of Justice, and of the rich girl in search of a husbandee, who went as paying guest at 15 guineas a week to a senior British official's wife, agreeing to pay for all wines and cigars and extras when society came to dine, but who, meeting only senior government officials and their wives, complained that she did not get her money's worth. And of my night visit to the temple of a headless monkey, God, full of bats, and of the English cotton manufacturer who defended conditions in his factory on the ground that the population of Egypt had been increasing far too rapidly under British rule, and that pulmonary consumption remained one of the few checks on it, and of the lame student's mother who, at the sports, said how much she regretted having put him on the mantelpiece when a baby and run off, being only 12 years old, to play with her dolls, and of the limit, so named by Australian soldiers, who told my fortune accurately in moonlight, under the long shadow of the Cheops Pyramid, and of my visit to Chalky Bey, the national poet of Egypt, in his Moorish mansion by the Nile, who was so like Thomas Hardy, and in whose presence his sons, like good Turks, sat dutifully silent, and of the beggar in the bazaar with too many toes, and of the British colonel who, during the war, on a dream of dearth, had played Joseph, dumping half the wheat of Australia in Egypt, where it found no buyers and was at last eaten by donkeys and camels, and of a visit to ancient dead Heliopolis, with its lovely landscape of green fields, its crooked palm trees, its water, wheels turned by oxen, and its single obelisk, and of our life in the other Heliopolis, a brand new dead town on the desert's edge, built by a Belgian company, complete with race, course and Luna Park, where the RAF planes flew low at night among the houses, and where the bored wives of resentful officials wrote novels which they never finished, and painted a little in watercolors, and of the little garden of our flat, where I went walking on the first day, among the fruit trees and flowering shrubs, but came upon no less than 8 lean and mangy cats dozing in the beds, and never walked there again. So back to Islip, much to the disappointment of my parents, who hoped that I had at last seen reason and settled down in a position which equally suited my needs and my talents, and to the undisguised relief of my sister-in-law. The remainder of this story, from 1926 until today, is dramatic but unpublishable. Health and money both improved. Marriage wore thin. New characters appeared on the stage. Nancy and I said unforgivable things to each other. We parted on May 6, 1929. She, of course, insisted on keeping the children. So I went abroad, resolved never to make England my home again, which explains the goodbye to all that of this title. Epilogue. Though often asked to publish a continuation of this autobiography, which I wrote in 1929 at the age of 33, I am always glad to report that little of outstanding autobiographical interest has happened since. The proofs of goodbye to all that reached me in Majorca, where I had gone to live as soon as I finished the writing, and which is still my home. The one serious setback to my quiet life here came with the Spanish Civil War in 1936, when all British subjects were advised to leave by warship. I wandered around Europe and the United States for 3 years and spent the Second World War in England because 3 of my children had joined the armed forces, the fourth, Sam, being prevented by deafness from doing the same. Jenny became a WAFE war correspondent, entering Paris with General Leclerc's tanks and Brussels with General Adair's, and nearly getting killed at Arnhem. Catherine, a WAAF radio operator, married squadron leader Clifford Dalton, now engineer-in-chief to the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. David joined the 1st Royal Welch, who had lost very heavily during the defense of Calais, assisted at their famous reunion with the 2nd Battalion in Madagascar, and then went on with them to India and Burma. He was killed on the Arakan Peninsula in March 1943 after going up with a sergeant and 1 man to bomb the Japanese out of 3 strongpoints, which had held up the battalion's advance. They captured the first strongpoint, and when his companions were wounded, David rushed the second single-handed, but was shot through the head trying to take the third. The War Office turned down his recommendation for a posthumous Victoria Cross on the ground that the attack had failed. An Indian battalion retired. The Japanese infiltrated, and what remained of the Royal Welch were forced to cut their way back. I volunteered for infantry service as soon as war broke out, but when informed that His Majesty could not employ me except in a sedentary appointment, I returned to work on a book about Sergeant Roger Lamb, who fought with the 1st Battalion in the American War of 1776-83, and on another about John Milton's behavior in the English Civil Wars. To avoid getting bombed unnecessarily, I settled in South Devon. Halfway through the war, someone invited me to join the Special Constabulary, but our village policeman declined to forward my application. His reasons, as I found out by discreet inquiry, were that my German second name made him suspicious, that I had been heard talking a foreign language to 2 disreputable foreigners, Spanish refugee friends. As it happened, one a major, the other a staff colonel, and that the words Heil Hitler had been found scratched on a vegetable marrow in my garden. So I continued merely as an air raid warden, but took a stern line a few days later when my age group got called up for medical examination, and the policeman brought me a 3rd-class railway warrant, together with an order to appear before a medical board at Exeter. As an officer on the pension list, I refused to travel except 1st class, a privilege to which my rank entitled me. He and I might find ourselves in the same compartment, and it would never do for us two to mix socially. So far as I was concerned, the red lamp, to put it that way, still burned red, and the blue lamp still true blue. Nancy and I eventually got divorced. I married again, have had 4 more children, enjoy good health, travel as little as possible, and continue to write books. What else can I say unless that my best friend is still the wastepaper basket? Though Charterhouse certainly has a very good name nowadays, and is even suggested as a worthy school for Prince Charles to attend, I do not send my boys there on principle. The other day, however, I met Uncle Ralph Vaughan Williams, O.M., for the first time since 1912, and as we talked fondly of Max Beerbohm, who had been in the same form as Uncle Ralph at Charterhouse, we suddenly found ourselves singing the Carmen Carthusianum in unison, to the surprise of a crowded Palma restaurant. I felt a little surprised, too, and it certainly is strange to think that the best British caricaturist and essayist and the best musician of my day have also been products of that most Philistine school. Goodbye to all that reads as ripe ancient history now, and I have so far passed the age when policemen begin to seem very young, that police inspectors, generals, and admirals do the same. Many of the familiar names that swim up from the past have acquired novel senses. For instance, mischievous young Corporal Mike Pearson, whom I recommended for a commission from the Oxford Cadet Battalion in 1917, has become Mr. Lester Pearson, Canada's most famous citizen. And by the way, Malcolm Muggeridge, until recently editor of Punch, who succeeded me at Cairo University, tells me that Colonel Nasser was one of my pupils there. I should not be surprised. Rural Majorca, too, with its 5 very moderate hotels, is now billed as Europe's most favorite holiday place. It boasts of 90 tourist planes flying in daily throughout the summer and a new first-class hotel completed every week. I can't pretend that I am pleased. And my children, the youngest of whom is 4 years old, look oddly at me when I tell them that I was born in the reign of Prince Charles' great-grandmother, before aeroplanes flew, when it was wicked for women to wear trousers or use lipstick, when practically nobody had electric light, and when a man with a red flag was required by law to walk in front of every motor car died. Yet I do not seem to have changed much mentally or physically since I came to live here, though I can no longer read a newspaper without glasses or run upstairs 3 steps at a time and have to watch my weight. And if condemned to relive those lost years, I should probably behave again in very much the same way. A conditioning in the Protestant morality of the English governing classes, though qualified by mixed blood, a rebellious nature, and an overriding poetic obsession, is not easily outgrown.